Hello, I'm Andrew Wilson, the Senior Aboriginal Access Officer at State Records, the archives to records of state government and local government in South Australia. I welcome you to this online Aboriginal family history event. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respect to elders past and present. I recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship to the land. I acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. And I also extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations. Thank you.
Interest in family genealogy began when she was a child living at Rauken. Living with her parents and grandparents, she was an inquisitive child. She loved yarning and asking questions because she was nosy and needed to know who was who and what was everyone doing. Over the years, I heard my mother referred to as an activist, an author, and quite a lot of other things. And yet she was a mother to her 9 children, 5 stepchildren, and with her long-term partner, Sid Chamberlain, was the stepchildren, and she was a foster mother to many other children, probably around about 15 to 20. The activist title was mainly due to her role in the Hindmarsh Island Bridge and secret women's business issues that occurred in South Australia. I won't focus on this except to say it took a heavy toll on my mother's health. And as her children, we did not really participate in the rallies and the meetings that went on with the whole Hindmarsh Island issue. We deliberately didn't participate because we knew that our mother needed to be able to come home, spend time with her family and rest and recuperate without having to tell us what she'd been doing. We knew what she was doing. We knew the importance of her work, and our focus was on building her health. Government and politics really played a heavy role in Aboriginal people's lives. We as Aboriginal people are used to being used as political football, and we do have to really suck it up and get on with things. But Mum did talk about, during the Hindmarsh Island Bridge affair, how important it was for her to get back to country and to meet many, many relatives and supporters. Everywhere she went, she was always bumping into relatives. She was always recounting stories, and people would ask questions about who's related to who, and she would be regular doing those things. But as an author, my mother wrote or co-wrote 11 books, mostly about family histories on Point Pearce and Rauken. And when I say Point Pearce and Rauken, it's inclusive of Kaurna because most of the Kaurna people were relocated to Point Pearce and Rauken. The first of the books was the Rigney family history in 1983. And there wasn't very much history books written by Aboriginal people about Aboriginal people. My mother wasn't a natural researcher. She had to learn how to research. And she had to learn the hard way because as a child, she only went to grade 5 in primary school. But she could read and write as good as the best. The format of her history books really looked at the apical ancestry and then the generations flowing from those ancestors. Most of the time she went down to 6 or 7 generations, depending on how big the book would be. For example, when she did the Sumner family genealogy, it was 4 volumes and quite huge, so she could not go down to the 5th and 6th generations. She wrote the Wanganeen history book in 1985, Kartinyeri in 1989, the Sumner's volumes 1, 2, 3 and 4 in 1998, the Wilson family in 1990. She was involved in the book Penindi, The Rise and Destruction of an Aboriginal Agricultural Community in 1989, the Nunkuwarrin Anzacs in 1996, the Wurrunga Nations in 2003, and the Nunkuwarrin Nation in 2006. And finally, Doreen continuing my Nunkuwarrin calling in 2008. And as you can see, she was quite prolific in her writing. Mum was proud of her work, but she had a special bit of pride about the Nunkuwarrin Anzacs. She grew up being told about her uncles going to war and that some of them never made it back to Australia. She thought about this often and she knew she had to do something because they died for their country. Even though they were not classed as citizens of Australia, they fought and died alongside their compatriots. She also knew that those who came back never received the same pay and benefits that the other Australians received for fighting for their country. So that was one of the real books that Mum was really proud of, and a very important piece of history. Mum was quite influential in establishing the South Australian Museum Family History Unit, along with Andrew's mother, Neva Wilson, and Steve Hemming. They're the only two I probably will name. She also utilised the South Australian Museum's Norman Tyndale collection and had contact with him a number of times. She really valued the work Tyndale had undertaken. It was extensive. She was quick to say that she thought he made a few mistakes, but when I read most of Mum's books, she made a couple of mistakes as well. And so the issue for Mum was to get the books done, whether she only had the 5 generations or the 7 generations, because she knew that coming down the line further as each generation grows, the amount of family that would be disconnected would be huge, and there was an important need to make sure that they all knew who they were and where they come from. Just as an example, I myself have something like 120 first cousins. My father's grandfather had 81 grandchildren. So when you start looking at the enormity of our kin and our relations, it can be quite huge. Life as a mother really began for Mum at Point Pearce after she married my father, Terry. This is when the learning for me began. Dad was a self-taught carpenter and was one of the first qualified tradespeople in Australia, South Australia. So naturally, myself and my brothers were quite skilled with their hands, and 3 of us became tradespeople. Although there was 3 of us boys before the sister Lydia was born, it caused a bit of a problem for us as boys. Our mother taught us how to knit, sew, crochet, and do all of the housework. And we were very skilled at those things by the time we were 10 years old. So at home, I'm the sewer of the family. At home, I'm the ironer of the family. So those skills Mum taught the boys was pretty useful. When my sister Lydia was born, She didn't have to do those things because Dad did everything for her, and so did Mum, so we were a bit jealous. Mum was quite gifted and undertook quite a number of activities. I might get you to move to the next page there, Andrew, for me. And to generate extra income, we used to help her to dye the, back to the previous one, help her to, the next one, yeah. We used to help her dye the feathers from the pelican to make feather flowers. And Mum had a certain way of doing it. She had to dry out the skin and cut it so that all the different sized feathers fitted neatly. And then she would go about constructing the feathers and making it into flowers with a long stem, and she'd wind them around some driftwood to make it look like a plant and a flower growing up a tree. And because of that work that Mum did in that, I learned how to make feather flowers. And so when I've seen a relative of mine doing it and doing it the wrong way, I had to point out that that's not the way to do it. She also used to rip up old shirts and make floor mats and sell them for a few extra bob. So Mum was quite skilled with her hands, and she did a lot of artistic work over her life. Another thing about my mother is she was a watcher of the royal family. She knew all about the British royal family, going way back past Queen Victoria, the Mountbattens and all of those. So anytime she would get a chance to read or watch a documentary involving the British royal family, she did. And I never did ask her whether she voted for the Republican movement back in the late 90s. I'm not sure what she would have done. Mum's early life at Rackham was pretty good. It was actually ideal when you sit down and look at it until she lost her sister, younger sister Nancy, as a result of surgery to remove her tonsils. Throughout her adult life, Mum couldn't get over the fact that her sister died undergoing routine surgery. But this wasn't unusual for Aboriginal people getting substandard medical treatment. These issues was exacerbated a little later when her mother Thelma died giving birth to Mum's sister Doris. The impact on the family was devastating. The results had major and long-lasting impact on my mother. As Mum tells it, her father, Oscar, my grandfather, was tricked into signing documents which led to Auntie Doris being taken away to Colebrook's home when my grandfather thought he was signing documents to receive welfare payments. Mum was later taken away and put into Fullerton's girls' home. This is where her knowledge of family tree came to the fore, because she bumped into other relatives who were there, and she was able to piece together and tell them stories about who they're related to, who they're cousins to, and quite often they talk about home together. And so that was one of the pleasing things. Mum also was quite feisty, and she got a bit stubborn while in the Colebrook girls' home. Eventually, they couldn't handle her and they kicked her out, really, and she became a domestic working for a couple of non-Aboriginal families. They thought of her as being too unruly, and they was worried about how she would go fitting in with being a domestic. But she was met with kindness by the people she worked with, and she began to trust and get used to non-Aboriginal people again, because up until that point, looking at the control of Aboriginal people's lives in Rauken and other mission stations, the control over her sister and the control over her in Colebrook Home, she really built up a resistance, and working for the as a domestic, she felt kindness, and her attitude to non-Aboriginal people softened. Mum later visited Point Pearce to see her Uncle Nat and Auntie Rose, and that's where there was quite a number of Nunkuwarrin families from Rauken living at Point Pearce. Some of the families were Kartinyeri, Varcos, Wilsons, Kartinyeris, and so on. But even there with the Nunkuwarrin and Narungga people, there was some issues at Point Pearce. It was not spoken about much, but there was some underlying issues there where the Nunkuwarrin ones stuck together. The rest of the Point Pearce ones, the Narungga ones, stuck together. They interacted, but they did have this little bit of a unspoken truce. And during this time, we really did spend a lot of time going to Rauken for Christmas or school holidays, where Mum would go back. The moment she rocks up into Rauken and she starts talking to her relatives, her accent would change. She'd start having that Nunkuwarrin twang, which was different to Narungga. And it was based on the environment she was with. We'd also spent time at Wellington with Mum's sister Connie. It was after these visits to Rauken that I learned never to ask Mum a yes or no question about anything to do with history or family, because if I wanted to go and play with my cousins, I couldn't get away for half an hour or more. So I got a history lesson every time I asked a question. If I knew how important that information was back then as it is now, I would have paid more attention. But Mum eventually came to the realisation she didn't want to live at Point Pearce forever. Her and my father were having marital problems, and we moved a fair bit. Kapunda, Paraka, back to Point Pearce, Wardang Island, and eventually Mum lived at Wingfield where her and Dad split. Mum later got together with Sid Chamberlain, and that's where the other stepchildren come into play. She lived in Cheltenham, Devon Park, Port Lincoln, Cummins, Port Germain, and eventually back at Point Pearce. Everywhere she went, she was always with family. Coming and going, extended family, and of course, she loved camping out bush and at the beach. Storytelling and meeting up with relatives, and then telling the younger generations their connections and families. They'd be always saying, Auntie Dada, what about this? And Auntie Dada, what about that? And on reflection, it seems that Mum was never really settled since being taken away from her ideal home at Rauken at such a young age. And that restlessness stayed with her for her whole life. I know my connections and that of my children going back 8 generations. And I also know that's thanks to my mother and father, and a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't have that luxury. Some of them don't even have their luxury of knowing their second and third cousins. And I reflect on non-Aboriginal families. They don't have very much interaction past their immediate family, and sometimes they couldn't even name their first or second cousins. I tried to name my third cousins once, and I got up to about 500 and I gave up. So my mother's work was amazing. She didn't like using a computer. She would always write what she wanted, first of all starting with a pencil, and it took a big effort just to get her to use a pen, because she didn't like using a pen because you couldn't rub it out if you had mistakes. And so she had a pencil sharpener, which was one of her favourite things. I remember the work she did it in the early hours of the morning, a lot of it, when she was relaxing at home, propped up in bed. Alongside her, she would have a packet of Wingfield menthols, a cigarette lighter, an ashtray, and a can of Bundy and Coke. And that would last her about 2 hours, that Bundy and Coke, until she finished putting what was in her head, and then she'd have a sleep and get up again in the morning. And when I read some of Mum's books, the Narungga Nation and her book, My Nunkuwarrin Calling, I can see the things starting to come alive. I can see my relatives. I can see the people. And so it's not just the written word. And when I look at my wife, myself, my children, I think our connections to Aboriginal communities in South Australia would cover 3/4 of South Australia. I can trace it all the way back to Wirangu, to Nudgeri, Ghana, and Nukunu, and those types of things. And that's all thanks to the work of my mother. I want to finish by reiterating the importance of Mum's work. And if we might take this to the next one. She really loved the church and the stained glass windows. We heard about them before we even got to Rauken as kids to really take notice of it. And one of the proud things that she done is she helped restore those windows with the sales of some of her books. But I want to finish by reiterating the importance of Mum's work and the importance of the Tyndale collection, but also the issues in wherever family history and history on our communities are stored. When thinking about kin and country, we have to be cognizant of the fact that the creation of Aboriginal mission stations had a huge impact on us as a people. It led to the moiety systems across Aboriginal Australia becoming redundant in quite a lot of those missions. And those systems kept the blood strong. So without an active moiety system, it was important for people to know who they were related to stop people marrying too close. And I suppose if there's one thing, that's a very important aspect. With thousands of our people being stolen, including my mother and my auntie Doris, being part of the stolen generation, it's important for them to have a way to find their way back. And so the other speakers today will cover off on how useful and important it is to research the records, to know who they are and where they come from. These days, there are still quite a lot of children being taken away, and people are worried there's going to be as much taken away in modern Australia as there was in the stolen generations. So it's vitally important for families to know who they are, who are their families, and how to reconnect. I know the Department of Child Protection here in South Australia develops a family genome to assist in keeping the child connected to family and in providing kinship care. Having access to the work of my mother, Tyndale, and the other researchers is very important for people to make those connections and make sure they're cared and they don't lose contact with their family. Being, becoming, and belonging helps us to be complete as an individual person, as a family, a community, and as individual Aboriginal nations that are never actually completely separated. An example is, I grew up on Point Pearce. One of our great rivalries in football is playing football against Rauken. And one game was just about to run out, people getting warmed up and getting aggressive and started, we're going to go out and thrash these Nunkuwarrin so-and-sos. And I looked at my teammates, there's 25 of us in the squad, and I said, all of you except one person are of Nunkuwarrin descent. So if you want to run your relations down, do so, but don't swear about them. And most of those fellows in my team did not know their connections to Rauken. And so it's important for people to know. So being, becoming and belonging is very important. It's also important in terms of being a common law holder in native title. for some reason, they've managed to wiggle back our apical ancestry to, in some cases, 5, 6 or 7 people when we were thousands strong. And you need access to the records to be able to prove that you are of country and you're entitled to be a common law native title holder when your group gets their native title. And for those who have been taken away and part of the stolen generations, it's harder again because they have to then get that acceptance to be able to be part of the native title. Mum found there are still plenty of people in our communities who possess the knowledge, and even if you can't get the records, there are people who still have knowledge about their family connections. There's not a month goes by without someone asking me questions about where they can get a copy of those books. They complain that when they're reading the book, they have to borrow off their sister or brother, and they stand over them while they're reading them in case they grow legs and walk out the door. My cousin Daisy always talks about how her brother won't even leave the table while she's reading his book, so I had to get her a copy and give her one of mine. It's important that the work of my mother and others is updated. It only goes back to 5 and some 7 generations, and it's important that in modern times that people are able to build on that for their own family's use. Accessibility was one of Mum's main objectives, and the challenge to make them available is a bit of a problem. So I know that my mother would be very proud of the work of Ali Abdallah has done to date in the Family History Museum of the South Australian Museum, and one of the challenges may be to how can we replicate the work in a digital format to make it readily available, because Mum wanted to make sure it's accessible to the Aboriginal community. As I said in my introduction, I'm CEO of Narungga Nation's Aboriginal Corporation, and one of the commitments I have in terms of working with state records is to finalise a Narungga protocol for access to the records there. But I'm also keen on developing and growing our own researchers, because it's important to have the Aboriginal lens that goes through to give the cultural context and meaning and support, because it's when we're reading it and we're passing it on to our children and our grandchildren, it's vital that they have that cultural context, and with that they can see it's probably only another 3 or 4 decades when there'll be no one alive who lived on an Aboriginal mission station and know what the control was like. And it's important that future generations know. It's important that Australia knows the full history of Aboriginal mission stations, the people, and the circumstances we have found themselves in. It's only just over 50 years since we've become citizens in our own country. So for our country, for nation building, for Australia, Australia will never be a complete nation if this history continues to be locked away. And the work of you as researchers is vital to building our country, Australia's best country in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Klynton. We really appreciate that. Couldn't agree with more of what you said. I'll just check if we have any questions here. We don't. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground. I think the questions may come later.
I just hope people heard properly.
They did. Apparently it's loud and clear. Our panellists were having some trouble in the other room, but apparently everybody else is hearing us quite well. Thank you for telling us your story and that of your mother. I've looked at both, or quite a few of her books, and they are all invaluable to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community to be able to find family so well documented. So thank you very much.
And thank you for inviting me here. It was hard to condense it down into 20 minutes.
It would be.
Almost impossible.
We might have to have you back for a longer version one day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Klynton.
Be a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. What we'd like to do now is introduce Karen George. Karen works for Linkup and Nunkuwarrin Yunti South Australia Incorporated, and she'll be talking us through the Linkup program. Thank you.
A bit of water here. So if I just go there, I'm going to change the PowerPoint. Am I on screen now?
Yep, you're on screen. It's all yours, and we use the mouse for all the keys for change.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen.
Good morning, everyone. What an act to follow, honestly, to be sitting in the seats of descendants of both Auntie Doreen Kartinyeri and Auntie Neva Wilson. I think, you know, these seats are really precious, and that was a phenomenal introduction to what we're really talking about today, because it is really critical. It's a really heartfelt thing, and I think that's really important to remember in all of this. So I want to thank Auntie Doreen and Auntie Neva for the beautiful work that they did, and at Linkup we still rely on those books. In fact, our Narungga Nation book has gone missing, so I know how precious they are. So we'll be wanting to get another one at some point. So to introduce myself, I'm the historian researcher for the Linkup SA program, which runs out of Nunkuwarrin Yunti of SA at the moment. We're 21 years old out of Nunkuwarrin Yunti, but Linkup has a longer history way back with the Aboriginal Childcare Agency and Uncle Brian Butler, and a lot of history behind that. So Linkup works with survivors of the stolen generations. We help them to reconnect with family, community and country from which they were removed as children under past government practices. We do family tracing research. We apply for records on the behalf of the client. We organise reunions where we can, a bit hard in these COVID times. Under our funding agreement, for someone to be eligible to become a Linkup client, they need to be of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island descent and have some kind of removal story, whether it be themselves removed, their parents or grandparents. So we do assist the children and grandchildren of stolen generation survivors. And we assist people who were removed in the period 1910 to 1975, and that's part of our funding agreement, even though we well know people were removed before that, and after it we are funded to help those people. So what happens a lot, particularly in my role, is many people ring up Linkup and they don't quite fit those tight eligibility criteria. So some have only recently learned about the fact that they may have possible Aboriginal heritage, but they don't know anything about their family and background because it was all kept quiet, and a lot of it was kept quiet because of the fear of being removed. So they want to know where their connections are. They want to find more about their ancestors, especially where they come from, who their community is and what country they are connected with. Other people that call up are already identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and they approach us because they want to know more about their family and their country, as Klynton mentioned, to get that wider connection with all their cousins and those kinds of things. So in my role as a historian researcher, I can offer them advice and some basic training so that these people can begin to do their own family history research. Sometimes once they do that, they do find that there is some kind of removal story and they come back to us as clients. So I'm going to talk to you as if you really don't know too much about research, because of the few hundred people out there I'm talking to, I don't know where you all are at. And as Klynton said, there's a starting point. He said that his mum didn't have a natural ability to research, but she became a really incredible researcher. So it's just about learning how to do it. So it can be really hard in the beginning. It's like, I imagine it, that you have a couple of jigsaw puzzles that you found in the garage. They're all muddled up in a huge pile, but you don't have that picture on the front of the box to figure out what the heck is going on. So you've just got to gradually draw those pieces together. It can be really daunting, and many people just don't know where to begin. So this event today is really unique because it's going to give you a starting point an introduction to all the different agencies that can help you to start to piece together those puzzle pieces. Sometimes you will be successful and you'll piece together all that you need. Sometimes you'll face challenges, you'll hit roadblocks, and sometimes you might find nothing at all, and that's where all the people speaking today are there to help you out with that. So I'm going to go really back to the beginning, because we're talking about records today, and we're not talking about that black piece of vinyl with the Beatles playing on it. We're talking about all kinds of things, though it can be also sound. That's one of the things that may be useful, sound records. So records can be all sorts of things. They can be official documents like birth, death, marriage, certificates, where you can find out the names, dates, family connections and connections to place. But often with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, official birth, death and marriage records were not made. So that's where we go to other kinds of records. And that can be the missions where a lot of people ended up. So baptism, church, marriage, burial and other church and mission records. Names, dates and family relationships can also be found in school admission registers, because when someone's enrolled in a school, they need to provide that basic information. There's also, as Klynton mentioned, Aboriginal people are under control of government, so lots of government records, welfare files, correspondence, minutes of meetings of both government and non-government bodies. Then you've got the police records, court, military, health, other sorts of official records. You may find official and private diaries and other written documents. Then you've got newspapers, magazine articles, photographs, genealogies, maps, sound, film recordings. The list goes on and on. So it's about piecing all those little things together to figure out your history. One of the most important things to be really aware of in searching and finding records in Aboriginal family history research is it can be emotionally challenging, because documents often contain really offensive and derogatory language which is just not acceptable today. You also can find conflicting and confusing information. One document might say one thing and another document says something completely different. And the differences between what was written down by governments and missions as opposed to what really happened and what is in people's memories, those people that Klynton talked about that you can still talk to and gather their stories, and that's really important to get both sides of that government official story. Records can also include very personal, private and sensitive information which can be distressing. I've got a little link on the bottom of the screen there. The AIATSIS has a wonderful family history toolkit, and it's got a really good introductory section relating to those challenges that you're going to face when you first start looking into these records, and AIATSIS is appearing later today. So the other challenge you face is the challenge of how records were kept in the past. So records may be missing. They may be purposefully destroyed. They may have been accidentally lost. Sometimes people just didn't write stuff down, so no documents were actually kept. So some organisations were really good record keepers, some were terrible. Then you've got the problems of current day record keeping policies, which mean that a lot of records are restricted for privacy reasons. You've got to apply for them through Freedom of Information or the other similar legislation in other states and territories. When they're provided to you, often information is blanked out, or redacted is the word we use, where it's blanked out because it's regarded as personal information. So they're some of the challenges that you may face when you are applying for those kinds of records. So today, a number of record holders have come together because the most important thing to understand about records relating to Aboriginal family history is that they're scattered across lots of different places: archives, record holders, non-government and government. So, just lost my track for a moment. So for this reason, it's really important to have some understanding of the kinds of records that were created about Aboriginal people before you start. So before our speakers present, I'm here to give you a very quick introduction. So as Klynton mentioned, First Nations people, in fact across the world, First Nations people have been under the control of government more than anybody else in the world, including here in Australia. This means that all sorts of records were created by government departments about individuals and families. The Protector of Aborigines, the Aborigines Protection Board and the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and all of its successors were part of the state government of South Australia. All kept copious records about the people under their control. Because these records were created by staff in a state government department, they're held at State Records of South Australia, which is the repository for South Australian government records. As well as documents created by the department responsible for Aboriginal affairs, State Records holds material from the other state government departments, which may be relevant to family history research. For example, records created for the department responsible for child welfare if a child was placed into state care. Education records, health, police, correctional services can also provide vital information for your research. This is the case too in other states and territories. If your family comes from outside of South Australia, we may be having people online from all sorts of places. Maybe some of you are in lockdown. I hope this is lightening your day. So today you're lucky to have Andrew Wilson, who's the Senior Aboriginal Access Officer at State Records of South Australia and the son of Neva Wilson, who Klynton mentioned. He's been at State Records for over 30 years, I think, and he'll talk to you about the records that he and other archivists at State Records can help you with. If your family connections are in the Northern Territory, the situation is a little different. The Territory was part of South Australia until 1911, and then from 1911 to 1978, it was brought under the control of the Commonwealth. This means that records created about the Territory during those periods will be held both by State Records of South Australia, but also by the National Archives of Australia. The National Archives also looks after records relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from 1972 onwards, after the Commonwealth Department of Aboriginal Affairs was established. So as well as records created by other Commonwealth government departments, they also hold immigration records, defence records, all those kinds of things. So Nick Gleghorn from the National Archives will be on later today to talk about the kinds of records that they hold and how you can get access to them. And I suspect he'll also mention the extremely important Bringing Them Home name index, which was created after the Bringing Them Home inquiry in 1997. As you know, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were pushed to live on mission settlements. The National Archives and State Records do hold some files relating to missions, because both the Commonwealth and the state governments provided financial subsidies to mission organisations and thereby requested reports and correspondence about what was going on. So there is some mission material in government records. However, the majority of documents relating to mission life and the people residing on missions are held in the archives of the religious organisations that ran the missions. Today, Rachel Kuchel from the new Lutheran Archives, and I think she's up next after me, will introduce you to their holdings and their finding aids, one of which we use a lot at Linkup, which is a guide to an index to names in Lutheran records. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra cares for more than 1 million items relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and histories. This includes photographs, genealogies, maps, language materials, anthropological papers, objects and other material. Donna-Maree Towney will introduce you this afternoon to the AIATSIS collections and to the many online resources that you can use to search those collections and learn about how to do family history research. The South Australian Museum holds similar collections here in South Australia. Unfortunately, staff from the museum's Aboriginal History Unit, Family History Unit are not available to present today, but a lot of our speakers will refer to the materials that are held there, and Klynton did talk about the work that was done by Doreen Kartinyeri and Neva Wilson in the Family History Unit, which still exists with Ali Abdullah Highfold working in there, using a lot of material that the museum has collected. And you will then be surprised by the wide range of information that you can find to aid in your research at Genealogy SA. This includes all sorts of things: births, deaths, marriage and divorce indexes, cemetery and hospital records, school admission records, family and community histories, electoral rolls, post office directories and much, much more. Sue Lear is here today to tell you about the treasure trove that is Genealogy SA. Oops. I'm gone. So I'm going to stop here so that you can hear from each of these speakers as they introduce you to the records that they hold, and I'll return later to talk about other places you can go. So I'll be back at the end of the day so that if you've exhausted all of those physical repositories, I'll talk to you a little bit later about records online and offline that you can go to find out more. So thank you for listening. We can see everything.
Excellent. So good morning, everybody. I'm Rachel Kuchel, and I'm the Director of Lutheran Archives. Lutheran Archives is the National Archive for the Lutheran Church of Australia. We hold the records for the congregations, the districts and the departments from all around Australia and wherever the Lutheran Church has had a ministry. Australian Lutherans have had a long involvement with Australian Aboriginal people dating from 1838 to current, and we have a significant collection of records relating to these ministries. The archives is located in Bowden, Adelaide, and the holdings include South Australian records from Adelaide, Port Lincoln and Encounter Bay, Bethesda on Lake Kilaupanina, Kaniba, Ceduna and Yalata. In the Northern Territory from Hermansburg and Fink River Mission, and in Queensland from Hopevale and Woorabinda, Wujul, which is formerly known as Bloomfield, Mariamba, Zion's Hill, which is now the suburb of Nunda in Queensland. The types of records that we hold for these missions include vital personal records, photographs and audiovisual items including films, audio cassettes and videos, records in language, administrative records created to operate the mission stations, reports and correspondence of the missionaries and mission staff, and a very small portion of records generated by Aboriginal people. I'm going to work through each of these types of records to give a better understanding of what they contain. However, first a note on accessibility. Most records are open to the public with the exception of some personal records, which I will explain shortly. Unfortunately, at this stage, our records are not searchable online. However, there is a published index available listing the holdings of our registers of pastoral acts. Opening hours for research are Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays and Fridays between 9:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. We do prefer bookings at the moment to manage our numbers in the research room, and there is a small research fee. We're always looking for partnerships to make our records increasingly accessible. Lutheran Archives has a Memorandum of Understanding with SA Linkup. This MOU covers research into personal records as contained in the registers of pastoral acts. It does not extend to researching or providing photographs, films, or other written archival holdings such as correspondence or reports. Whilst the MOU is officially only with SA Linkup, we do extend the MOU to other Linkup agencies around the country. If you are not coming through a Linkup agency but are not in a position to pay for research for vital personal records, we will usually waive this fee. However, we are unable to waive fees for provision of photographs, films, and other archival holdings. The best source of information we have for researching an individual is through our registers of pastoral acts. This means our records of baptisms, confirmations, marriages, burials, obituaries, and personal and family records. An index to these registers was published in 1999 in this publication, A Guide to Records of Indigenous Australians in the Lutheran Archives. This index lists the records that we have for individuals in two listings. Firstly, it is arranged by place or mission and alphabetically by surname within each mission. Secondly, it is arranged as a composite index, that is, alphabetically across all the missions. It is important to note that this is an index only and lists the records that we have, but does not give the information contained within the record. For this, you will need to contact Lutheran Archives. This guide is available in many libraries across Australia or can be purchased from Lutheran Archives for $20 plus postage. Our registers of pastoral acts contain quite a lot of personal information, but unfortunately it can be quite variable in detail. Baptism records, for example, can contain birth dates and places, parents' names, places of abode, and sponsors, but often only contain some of these details. Personal and family records, two examples which can be seen on screen, contain as much information as is known about an individual at that particular point in time. They can include information such as all children, marriage details, language or skin groups. Again, the amount of information can be quite variable. There are a number of other records that contain personal information or identify individuals. We are currently working through our holdings to identify these series of records. We have found records such as wage registers, ration details, telegrams, requests and permission to leave mission stations. Individuals can also be mentioned in minutes for the various mission boards, as well as some correspondence. We have not publicised that we hold these types of records before, I think in part because we didn't know the extent of the records that we held until we started scoping and specifically looking for these records. However, we recognise that these records are incredibly important to one's knowledge of self and one's history. Whilst we understand how important they can be, they are also very personal. I have therefore titled these types of records Considered Access. To be able to access these records, you must clearly demonstrate a close connection to the person in these records. We would give access to the individual, to their children, and depending on the age of the person in the record, perhaps to a grandchild. These records are currently not indexed, and it is therefore difficult to locate individuals within the series. However, this is a priority action for us over the coming year. In the first instance, to adapt our database so that they can be indexed and searchable by archivists. Listings of the individuals in these record series will not be publicly available as they are very personal records. I would kindly ask that you don't flood us with requests to search these records as yet, simply because we are a small staff of 2 and we do not have the capacity to trawl through these records at the present moment. It will be of greater benefit for us to spend our time identifying the series and indexing the records so that we can readily search these records in the coming year. Now we come to our visual records and audiovisual records. Our collection has many visual and audiovisual records. This includes slides, photographs, photograph albums, glass plate negatives and lantern slides, as well as 8 and 16mm films, audio cassettes and videotapes. The photographs, slides and albums are catalogued and can be searched on our database within the archive, or we can run reports for you and email these through. Images depict daily life at the missions, significant church events, as well as individuals. All images have been identified as far as possible. However, the reality is, in most cases, we do not know the names of individuals. I've been showing you some lantern slides from Hope Valley Mission dating from the late 1800s to the 1930s. The images were taken by the missionaries, who definitely knew all the individuals they depicted, but then turned into a slideshow of sorts by Reverend Otto Tyler, the Director of Mission. The images were shown in Lutheran congregations across Queensland to garner support for the mission at mission festivals. These are some images from Kinniba Mission. In 2015, Lutheran Archives was involved in a project with the mobile language team of the University of Adelaide. Our part of the project was access to digitisation of all our images pertaining to Kinniba. As a result, images can be viewed at the Far West Language Centre in Ceduna. In a similar project, since 2019, images pertaining to Kuchel and Hopevale, Queensland missions are digitally available at Hopevale and Kuchel Indigenous Knowledge Centres. We also have many 8 and 16mm films, and our film collection comprises several films from Kinniba and Hopevale and many films from Fink River Mission, Central Australia. Most of the Central Australian films were produced by an amateur filmmaker and great supporter of the mission, Lou Borgelt, who would travel around Australia showing the films to generate support of the missions. Most films have been digitised and copies can generally be purchased from Lutheran Archives. A film portal will be available later this year to view the content. In the mid-1990s, photographs from Central Australia were loaned to AIATSIS and copied by AIATSIS. However, you can see here that the quality of digitisation has dramatically increased since then. Yet coming to the collection via AIATSIS is an excellent way to become aware of our collection and our holdings. We have many records in Aboriginal languages, and this can include vocabularies, translation of hymns, Bible portions, catechisms, primers. Some works are published and some are handwritten. On the screen are the first 4 Lutheran missionaries in Australia who ministered to the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. They were sent by the Dresden Mission Society, arriving in Adelaide in 1838. They established a school at Piltawadley soon after their arrival and began to teach the children in Kaurna, having sufficiently learned the Kaurna language. They were able to already print a vocabulary and a primer in 1840 and 1841. These records left by the missionaries have formed the basis of the Kaurna language reclamation program. We have many records in Aboriginal languages, and you may wonder why. The reason is because it is very important to Lutherans to be able to worship and read the Bible in the vernacular, that is, meaning in one's own language. This meant that missionaries were tasked with learning the languages of the people they were ministering to, recording those languages, and translating the Bible, hymns, and the catechism into the local language. This also meant understanding and documenting the local culture so that translations could be meaningful. All of this work now means there is a rich legacy available of language resources for the many Aboriginal language groups that have had an interaction with the Lutheran Church. A brilliant resource for understanding particular events or time periods in the life and story of a mission is the articles published in church periodicals and reports presented at annual or triennial synodical conventions of the Church. Detailed reports for each church department, including the mission departments, are presented at these synodical conventions. These reports include staff reports, an account of the operation of the mission station, a financial report, and details of the Aboriginal people residing at or interacting with the mission, not on an individual level, however. There are also many articles published in church periodicals, and the bonus here is that the articles are generally accompanied by photographs. These articles and reports are perhaps the easiest way to gain an understanding of the history of the missions for any particular time frame. There are also many published works on the various Lutheran missions throughout Australia. One excellent web resource is German Missionaries in Australia, published by Griffith University, and you can see the URL on the screen. Other written records include correspondence, reports of mission personnel, minutes of meetings, and so forth. Many of the records in our collection are written in German, and not only in German, but they're in an old script until as late as the 1930s. To make these records accessible, our focus has been not on digitisation, but on transcription and on translation. We transcribe from the old German script into ordinary lettering and then translate into English. Because of the significance of the mission records and the enormous research potential, mission records have been a strong focus for our transcription and translation program. A considerable amount is transcribed already, although not yet translated, and so that will be our next challenge. I want to end showing this transcript made in the 1980s of objections submitted by Aboriginal people to the federal government's proposed land right, handing the Finke River Mission title to a corporation of traditional owners. As a result of submissions made by the traditional owners, which was facilitated by mission staff, 5 separate titles were granted to 5 individual families of traditional owners. And this is one instance where we do actually have the voice of Aboriginal people recorded and available for research. So we really want to make our records accessible, and that's our aim, and we're always looking for partnerships for ways that we can continue to increase the accessibility of our collection. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Lots of information there for people. We did have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Someone was asking, are there any Victorian records in your collection?
Not really. I mean, we have, obviously, we have congregation records and records of the Victorian district, but there was no mission in Victoria.
What about New South Wales?
The same too with New South Wales. So our missions were in South Australia and Central Australia, and then in Queensland.
Okay, wonderful. You're getting lots of very positive feedback here. Everyone thought it was awesome, so thank you.
Excellent.
All right, well, what we'll do now is, unless there's any more questions, let me just double check. No. Chat. No. More thank yous. Okay. What we'll do now, thank you, Rachel, is I will get Nick Gleghorn to come and sit with me, and I will share our presentation again, and we will start with the National Archives. Thank you, Rachel.
Pleasure.
Okay, so we've got our PowerPoint back. And I will now hand over to the wonderful Nick Gleghorn. Thank you.
Okay, I can't see myself, but I assume you can. Hello, everyone. As Emily said, my name's Nick Gleghorn. I'm the State Manager of the South Australian Office of the National Archives. And I'd like to start, sorry, let me just move it on. Oh, sorry. There we go. I'd like to start just by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I speak today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And also to acknowledge all Aboriginal people who might be joining us here today, which I hope there are many. As we've heard already from our speakers, it's highly likely you're going to have to go to many organisations as part of your family history research. So it's important to understand, I suppose, what each organisation holds, and that's what we're doing here today. So the National Archives of Australia is the archive of the Commonwealth Government. So that's pretty fundamental in terms of understanding what we hold. So most of our collection dates from 1901, and it comes into collection because it's been part of a business of Commonwealth Government. Obviously, we don't keep everything, so what comes to us at the end of its sort of active life is what we consider the most significant records. We have collections or repositories in each state and territory, and a research centre in each state and territory. We've got over an estimated 40 million items across a whole range of formats. Lots and lots of old sort of paper files and records, but also index cards, photographs, film, plans, objects, all kinds. And these records relate to, I suppose, the full range of activities that the Commonwealth's been involved in since 1901. So this includes sort of high-level government business, such as cabinet decisions, establishment of federation, royal commissions, and then records as well that are a bit more sort of people-focused, specific individuals in terms of defence service records, immigration records. Those kind of records are very popular with family historians. And then we've got records created by Commonwealth departments that are responsible for aspects of Aboriginal affairs. I think Karen said earlier, really the Commonwealth has only really been involved in managing Aboriginal affairs, if you like, since the late 60s into the 70s. So prior to that, most records are with state and territory archives. The exceptions are the Northern Territory, which was under Commonwealth administration between 1911 and 1978. And Victoria, where when the Commonwealth assumed responsibility in, I think, 1975, earlier records also passed to Commonwealth. So there are records in our collection in Melbourne that go back to 1860. But generally, those records, I suppose, that we identify with family history research for most states are more recent. But still lots of files relating to policy as well that sometimes can be of interest. Just move this on. And just a visual, I suppose, representation of some of those points. Top right, you've got an image of the State Library of South Australia. That's where in Adelaide we're based. So you can come in and look at original records and speak to staff here within the library, National Archives staff, to get advice on your research. We are open Wednesday to Friday, 10 till 5. But we have, as I said, research centres across Australia, so you can check the website in terms of opening hours and locations wherever you might be based. And then just to make the point, I suppose, in terms of different sort of aspects of our collection, certainly lots of photographs in our collection. You can see some sort of pivotal historical moments represented there. We've got Vincent Linkup and Gough Whitlam from 1975 in the middle of the screen. We've got members of the Federal Council for Aboriginal Advancement in 1967 meeting Harold Holt to press the case for the referendum in 1967. Also got lots of photographs, certainly in South Australia, relating to railways, which often represent Aboriginal people and communities. It's probably an area that could be explored a bit further in terms of finding out more about those people and communities represented within those photos. But those represent more sort of day-to-day sort of subjects, I suppose. We've got plans in our collection, and that plan is from our Victorian collection. That's Lake Tyers Aboriginal Station, and also lots of petitions it's quite significant petitions in terms of sort of land rights and over from the 1930s onwards. This one from 1972 is a Lear petition, which is a very striking and important document. You can see it's ripped there, and that's when the Lear people were trying to present the petition to Princess Margaret in Darwin in 1972, and a scuffle broke out and the petition was ripped. So that's just a general idea of some of the items in our collection. This isn't going to be just about South Australia, this talk, so as I've said, we're a national organisation, but I did just want to, while we're talking about petitions, point out this document from 1947, which is a petition relating to social security or pensions, and it's from Point Pearce, 1947, and that sort of represents some of the interesting earlier records in our collection where there's a social history element, but also a family history component in the sense that there are names there represented. So, how do you access the collection? I haven't got time today to go into much detail in terms of searching the collection, but the website's certainly a good place to start. So naa.gov.au, and in terms of what's in the collection, how you go about requesting records and doing research, this is a good place to start. And you can navigate just on the home page as I've done here in this screenshot, you can navigate to various pages that give you this advice. There is actually one on First Australians. So if you click on that, it takes you to this page, and this provides a lot more information about some of the, I suppose, processes you need to go through in terms of getting access, but also the records themselves. And as I said, this isn't purely on South Australian records, so we've got on the website several research guides that might be of interest. Tracking Family is a guide to Aboriginal records produced by the NAA relating to the Northern Territory, but it covers many of the organisations talking today in their collections, so it's not purely NAA. And then there are also a couple of publications relating to researching Aboriginal family history at the Victorian Archives Centre, and that's where we're co-located with the Public Record Office of Victoria, and that publication looks at both collections there. So you might have seen also available via the website, and is access to our online catalogue, and that is called Record Search. So you can find lots of access points throughout the website to Record Search, and that's probably your main, certainly the sort of tool that you would be using most in terms of pursuing your family history research at National Archives. Lots of ways of searching, and I won't go into all of these. You have got the option, you can see at the top of the screen, of using name search, which is quite good for family history research, because you can put in a name but limit it just to defence records, for instance, or other types of records. Immigration records are popular with family history. You can also search just photographs using photo search. But I've just done, you'll hear throughout today references to Everett Sumner. We've produced a bit of a case study. Lots of organisations hold similar, records relating to Everett Sumner. So just to do a basic search here, just to show you what it looks like when you get the results. And you can see there are a few records in our collection relating to this person. All but one of these in the list relates to him, and then there's a bit of a rogue return there in the middle, and that's just because Sumner and Everett come up in that title as well. But you're always going to have that as part of family history research, where you have to sort of weed out the ones that are not relevant. And you can see here that it tells you where the records are located. While there are 2 in Adelaide, there are also records in Canberra and Sydney. Now, we don't move records around the country, so if you need to, if you want to access those in Canberra and Sydney, and obviously not at the moment, but under usual circumstances, you could either pay for that or go there and look at it for free in the reading room there. In this case, you'd actually be quite lucky, because you wouldn't have to do that because they're all digitised. So where records have already been digitised, you can see that column. There's an icon there. You can click on that and actually view the whole document online, or generate a PDF that you can save to your desktop or print out. And many of these records here relate to military or defence service, which is one of our most popular areas for family history research. So I might just quickly mention that although Everett Sumner's records relate to World War I, many people know that World War I service records have been digitised, have been for many years. We've also got records relating to the Boer War, World War II. There's a project at the moment to digitise those, and records relating to Navy service, court martials, and repatriation files. Just all those types of records on the list there. In terms of Everett Sumner's, this is just an example of what we found from those records that came up in the search. World War I, so you can see he was born in Point Macleay. This is very familiar to many family historians, type of record. This is the enlistment, the attestation paper for World War One. So you get these standard details in these files. At the end, you usually get which medals people were eligible for. In this case, you also get sometimes additional bits of information. So you might get letters written by the servicemen or their family. This one's Everett from 1944 is wrote a letter and a statutory declaration just saying, pointing out that he'd lost his discharge papers, had been stolen, his kit bag had been stolen. But there's also other records from World War One. We've got a pay file record, so that's his pay book, and we've got a repatriation, several repatriation files as well, which sort of tell the story of when he came back. So we have lots of those are available now from World War One, and many of them relate to assistance provided to servicemen over those post-war years or medical assistance. This index cards, this series is a good example of how sometimes those small details can be very important in terms of locating people. And these records are actually held in our SA office. They're from the 1920s and 30s, and there's lots of detail here about support Everett received, mainly to do with his work, so fares between various places like Narong and Kingston there on the screen. So record search, you can go online, you can do a variety of things. You can search for records, you can view records that are digitised, you can pay for records that aren't digitised, and you can also go and ask us a question about the collection by filling out the form here on the screen, just on our website. And in many cases, you might not find what you're looking for, and you require further assistance, and we'll respond to those questions within 30 days. As usually, I've probably talked too much there, so I did want to, that's the sort of general overview in terms of how you search the collection, record search. That would apply to most people conducting family history research. There's two specific areas I wanted to go into in terms of Aboriginal family history research that I should point out. One of those, so the 1991, the report into the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and then also the Bringing Them Home report in 1997, both made recommendations around the importance of making these archives available to Aboriginal people and to re-establish links with family and country. And one of the things that the National Archives did in response to those recommendations was create an index called the Bringing Them Home Index. And that targeted specific records in our collection that would be of interest to Aboriginal people conducting family history research, and indexed records by name, by the names of places that might be significant. So things like places like missions and institutions, and other details from these records, just to make them more accessible. As we know, record search, what I showed before, that works quite well if the name of a person is in the title, that will come back, or the name of a place. Not so well when a file has a very general sort of title and the names are contained within. So this index tries to tries to address that issue. And this is just a list of some of the records that have been targeted by the Bringing Them Home Index. As I said before, overwhelmingly, these records that we hold are from the Northern Territory and Victoria. And the next slide is a visual just showing you the number of names. It's quite an old slide, but it just shows you the balance is definitely from the Northern Territory, Victoria. I will just move on quickly. Just a couple of screenshots here. This shows you, you actually can't access the Bringing Them Home Index. It's not available to the public for privacy reasons, but you can request archive staff to do a search, and we'll get back to you with the results there. And this just shows you what it looks like when we do a search for Everett Sumner. The advantage there is that some of these, in this case, this just comes up with the files that we got in record search, but in many cases, lots of the names will produce no results in record search, and they'll be sort of listed as next of kin or other family members on these files, and they'll come up in this search. And just to try and finish quickly, I said you can request a search of the Bringing Them Home Index by contacting the National Archives. You can do that most successfully if you apply under one of the memorandum of understandings that we've established in the Northern Territory in 1997, Victoria in 2000, and South Australia in 2002, which was renewed in 2019. And that basically, if you go through the Linkup organisation, if you in these states, so in Nunkuwarrin, Yunti in South Australia, then you're eligible to receive 3 copies of these records that we find when we do a search of the BTH index. And you may be able to get access to records that would not normally be available to you under normal access processes. And I might just finish there, just to say recently, lots of work carried out in the last 20 years, and we're continually building on that. We've just released Our Way, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Protocols, and that builds on the sort of principles established in 2019 in the Tanzania Adelaide Declaration as part of the ICA summit. I might leave it there.
Thanks, Nick. Greatly appreciate it. Just see if we've got any questions. I'll try the Q&A instead, that probably helps. No, I think we've answered them all while you were talking, so thank you very much, greatly appreciate it. And we'll introduce our next speaker, the lovely Suzy Russell from State Library. And Suzy and I are going to create some magic together with doing direct links from PowerPoint. So bear with us, we're both a little bit nervous about this, but we'll get through this together. So, shall I drive or will you?
I'd like to drive the
Okay.
that bit, but perhaps I'll just turn the slides with this one.
Yep.
Okay. May I begin?
Go for
I'm
it.
ready to go. I'm waiting for the clapper or something. Yes, as Emily mentioned, my name's Suzy Russell. I work at the State Library of South Australia in the research team, and learning a lot from the other speakers today. I hope you are too. Like the speakers before me, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today in this building, and my workplace is on the traditional land of the Kaurna people. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which each of you are meeting today, anywhere in Australia. So who is the State Library? What do we do here? Well, we're the state's largest public reference library. We provide a general reference service. So we kind of share some administrative functions with the South Australian Public Library Service, but we differ from your local public library in a few key areas. Like your local library, we have a collection of books on a range of topics, accessible on site at our North Terrace location. But one of our roles is to provide, one of our roles is to provide a general reference service to the people of South Australia with these books. But our core purpose is to maintain a comprehensive collection of the documented history of South Australia. And our South Australiana collections are acquired by purchase, donation and legal deposit. And legal deposit is a law which states that anything published in South Australia, like a book, magazine, newspaper, one copy must be deposited with us here. Once in the State Library's collection, we have a responsibility to preserve and provide access to these items, both now and for future generations. And it's because of this responsibility that we don't lend our collection, unlike your local library would. So today I'm going to talk about some of these collections and some of the tools that we have at the State Library that can be of assistance to those researching their family history, and specifically those wanting to learn more about their Aboriginal heritage. So I'll be referring to the State Library's collections as published and unpublished. Published material refers to anything that was made public and mass produced, even if just a small run, like books, newspapers, newsletters, annual reports, musical recordings, etc. And the library has pretty good coverage of these because of that obligation I mentioned for publishers to provide us with a copy of anything published in South Australia, although there are some gaps still. Where something is about South Australia or by a South Australian but not published here, then we purchase a copy of that to try and maintain that full collection. Now, unpublished material or archival material, as you've heard some of our colleagues talk about, is anything that was not mass produced but instead could be described as a unique item, one that was often not produced for a public audience. And this might refer to things like photographs, oral histories, home movies, letters, minutes, that kind of thing. So the library acquires this material through donation from families, businesses, clubs, churches, and non-government organisations. Unlike published material, there is no obligation to donate this to the library, and so we can only provide ad hoc coverage. For instance, we might have 300 photographs of your town or suburb, or only 3, depending on what's been donated to us over the years. Now, with limited resources to store, preserve and describe new material, the library can't accept everything offered to it. And so when considering donations, we try and discern what will be of value for future generations. Because our role is to provide an insight into the lives and experiences of all South Australians, we have a particular focus, especially now, on identifying and trying to fill gaps in the stories and voices that we collect and preserve. And it is acknowledged that in the past, the library has prioritised collecting material around the colonial experience and the dominant white culture. And we've lacked a diversity of voices and experiences in our collections, including those of First Nations people. And this is a failing that we are working to address. So with that context and introduction, I'd like to talk about some of the resources that we have here that will prove valuable for those researching their Aboriginal family history. If you're new to researching your family history and not really sure where to start, well, our website has a great page. Emily, sparkly costumed assistant, has a great page that can act as a launch pad to discovering the library's resources. So if you just scroll down, Emily, you'll see that it brings together a lot of the most used resources like Trove, Index to Birth, Deaths and Marriages, electoral rolls, funeral notices, etc. And if you click on each of these links, it will take you to some of those highly used resources. So other speakers today will or have already touched on some of these, so I won't dwell on them, but please be aware that being familiar with these resources is valuable to anyone undertaking family history research. And some of them will take you off to some of the other institutions that are talking today. And you can find that on our website by just going to the home page, collections, and then family history. The presentation will be available as a PowerPoint later if you wanted to click through any of the links. So now I'll just talk about our published resources. So as I said, these are things that were made public, like books, newspapers. We're all pretty familiar with what a publication is. And there are a number of excellent publications that we hold that contain detailed genealogies for Aboriginal families in South Australia. Emily, I would like to go to the next slide, and she's not letting me. Thank you. Including all of those books compiled by Doreen Kartinyeri that Klynton Wanganeen mentioned in his keynote presentation. So anything published in South Australia, as I mentioned, we should have a copy of here. And I'll show you shortly where we've got a library guide that shows a whole lot of different publications that contain genealogies. But even when they don't contain names or detailed biographical information, published items like biographies, autobiographies, local community and mission histories can be a rich source of information about the lives that your ancestors lived and give you clues and leads to further sources of information via their bibliographies. So for instance, if you didn't know which archive might hold the records of a certain mission, when you go to look at a book about it, you'll see in the bibliography all the different places that they found the records. So going to published sources first can be a good shortcut to finding out where unpublished and archival collections might be. So I've just got a couple of library guides that I wanted to show you, and I've linked to them in the presentation. we use library guides as a way of bringing together useful resources on a particular topic. So as an example, in our Aboriginal Family History Guide, we've got some sort of general information at on the home page, and then we've got a page on State Library resources. On the left, it's got a whole lot of guides to researching family history, including some that are indexes for some of the other archives, like the Lutheran Archives, State Records, etc. But on the other page, on the other side of the page, we've listed a bunch of genealogies that have been published. Some of these are purely genealogical publications, others are histories, but they include quite a lot of genealogical information. So it's some good starting points there as well. Another one of the guides we've put together is on Aboriginal missions in South Australia. So for those missions that we have a reasonable amount of information, we've created their own tabs. Other missions is for some of those missions where we only have a few references. But for each of them, we try and go through what books we've got in our collection, if we have any records, or if not, where they might be. Here's that Lutheran Church Archive Index, articles, and any other useful information that we might have on the mission. The guides are also, so they have a good sort of introduction to the resources that we have, but if you're looking for more, then quite often there'll be some tips on how to search in the catalogue. And if you've been researching for a while, you'll know that every different service and catalogue has a slightly different technique that you need to use. So it can be good to get some hints from those guides as well. And we also have on our website a guide, if you just put back on the thing, thank you, a guide to how to search better in our collection, and there's a link to that in the presentation as well. We call it Search Like a Librarian. When you are searching, so it's important to remember that when you are searching the library catalogue, that you're not actually searching inside the books, you're not searching the contents. You're only going to find matches for your search terms if they appear in the catalogue record. And so, when you're looking for names, when you're trying to find details of an individual, that can be a hindrance. So to aid family history research, the library has gone through a number of South Australian resources and indexed them, creating catalogue records for individuals named within them. And I apologise for the very amateur photo that I've included there of some of the resources in our collection that we've indexed. So each of the names listed in those books and in the annual report of the United Aborigines Mission and the Aborigines Friends Association, if there's a name in there, it's included in the catalogue, so that when you do a search on that name, it'll tell you it's in this book on this page, and that way you're sort of searching inside the book. And those annual reports are particularly useful. So as an example, the annual report of the United Aborigines Mission contains references to people living at Nekabunna, Oodnadatta and Colebrook Home, and they often mention people who have done something sort of noteworthy during the year, like moving to or from the mission, gaining a new job, or performing well at school or in a sporting team, etc. And they do sometimes have birth, death, marriage and funeral information as well. So they can be a really excellent source of family information. I'm just going to get you to go to the catalogue if you wouldn't mind, Emily. So to search for the name of an individual, and as I said, there is more tips for how to search in the catalogue on our website, but just as an example, if you were going to search for a name that we've indexed, we would suggest that instead of doing it as a keyword search, that you do a subject search. So we'll do Sumner Everett, as we've been talking a bit about him today. And there's two links, one of which is somebody without a middle name, and I know that that's not the Everett Sumner that we're after, but Everett Luke Sumner, our catalogue will link you to 4 or 5 different resources where you can find more information about him. So it might be in a book like this, A History of Point Macleay Reserve and District. We also have reference to him in one of our archival record groups relating to his service in the First World War, and then a couple more links, again, mostly relating to his service. If you click on the link, it takes you to the catalogue record and tells you this is the book it's in, this is the page, and it'll give you a bit more information about what you'll find there. And we have actually gone through all of our publications and tried to identify any Aboriginal service people. So you should usually find records to them when you're searching in our catalogue. Thank you. So not all of our books have been indexed in this way, but there are about 2,000 records that we've created to point you to names and biographical information. We've indexed about 30 or 40 different titles, and we aim to complement the AIATSIS Aboriginal Biographical Index, which I'm sure the staff at AIATSIS will talk about later. So now heading on to unpublished collections. So unpublished or archival collections include photographs, oral histories, donated records of individuals or organisations, including some churches and non-government organisations. Now, we don't have government records, that's State Records and National Archives, who you'll be hearing from today. It's important to know, as Karen mentioned, that the extent of the holdings for places like homes or churches, etc., will vary because there wasn't an obligation for these organisations to lodge their records with us. We can only accept as donations what they kept and what they've passed on to us. So sometimes the surviving records are quite piecemeal or incomplete, and they may not contain the information that you're seeking. So using a guide like Find and Connect will help prepare you for the experience of accessing such records. And Karen George, who probably normally hides her light under a bushel, was one of the main researchers for Find and Connect in South Australia. So we've got her expertise to look forward to later on as well. How am I going for time? My apologies, I will have 7 minutes. Okay, well, I might just quickly show you one example of an unpublished collection that we have. You can just go into the catalogue for me, Karen, and I'll do a little search. So as an example, the Wiltshire Hostel was a home run in Millswood, South Australia by the Aborigines Advancement League to provide accommodation for girls who were attending or had recently completed secondary school in Adelaide. And I'll just go back to the home page and go to our catalogue. You'll always find the banner there. And I'll just do a search on Wiltshire. So when you go to Find and Connect, it tells you that the Wiltshire Hostel ran from about 1956 to 1978. Our catalogue shows a few hits for Wiltshire, but this is the record I'm looking for because I know that it was run by the Aborigines Advancement League, as it tells me in Find and Connect. And then I can read a bit about what we hold here, but if I go into the link that says Finding Aid Series List, it'll give me a list of everything in that collection. Oops, or will it? Maybe it won't. All right, that hasn't worked for some reason. But basically it goes through and it lists the collection that's held there. And it shows us that they have records for, say, admission records for like 2 years, 73 to 75 or something like that. Matron reports for 2 or 3 years. So it's telling you that even though we do have some records, unfortunately we don't have them all. Find and Connect says that State Records has some as well. And so perhaps between the two organisations, you may find what you're looking for. I can go back to the thing, thank you. Now, some of our unpublished collections contain significant cultural information, including content that is sacred and restricted. And we do have the library's Indigenous Collections Coordinator and Indigenous Archives Officer who are able to provide culturally safe access to those wishing to view content about their families or communities in those collections. So we have some more restrictions around those collections because of some of the content, but we can provide access for family information through a slightly more mediated way. So just bear that in mind. Other parts of our unpublished collection include oral histories and photographs. So oral histories take the form of a planned interview with the goal of recording people's unique life experiences. They are often collected as part of a project, maybe because the interview subjects have shared experiences like growing up in the same place or working in a particular profession, having the same cultural background. And sometimes we have recordings, other times transcripts of the recordings, and sometimes both. And they quite often, especially at the start, they might just say, my name is, and then they'll launch into sort of quite a detailed family history of their own to give that information at the top of the interview. So they can be excellent resources of family history. The State Library has an extensive collection of photographs as well, and more than 100,000 images are viewable through the State Library catalogue. Like other unpublished collections acquired by donation, some places and aspects of South Australian life are well represented, others not so much. To search for a photograph, if you go to our catalogue as we were in before, thank you so much. I'll just do that, that's right. Go back to our home page and go to our catalogue. So I put in Nepabana. And that will tell me everything in the library that has the word Nepabana in the catalogue record. But if I just want photographs, I can narrow it down, and then I've got a list of the photos that we hold. If you click on the link to view image, obviously it takes you into the photograph, and you can zoom in quite a lot if you want to. Tip for experts is when you're in this field, if you put in another search term in the search box up here, you can actually do a visual search of photographs. So that can be a lot easier than going through list by list. This one isn't as accurate or precise, but it can be a lot easier to search. And our photographs are all available. Anything that you can view outside the library, you can usually download a copy for yourself for public use, but we can also purchase higher quality copies if you want. Now, sadly, many of the photographs that we have lack meaningful information identifying individuals. That's not unique to collections with First Nations people, but it's quite common. So if you are ever looking through photos and you're able to help us further identify individuals, that's fantastic, because we really want to be able to identify everybody in our collection. I'll just finish off by showing you some of our library guides, which are, as I said earlier, just a way of bringing together, that's right, I can do it, thank you, bringing together information on given topics. So if you go to our homepage and scroll down to this link, view the guides, you'll get a list of a number of guides. Now, we've got several that we've put together on Aboriginal Australia, including some on Aboriginal family history, stolen generations, languages, missions, etc. And we also have an extensive range of family history guides on any manner of topics. So quite often they tell you how you can find things in the library, but also when there are resources on site as well. So some of the things that they'll also be talking about later with the from SA Genealogy. So just finally, I'll show you how to ask for more help should you need it. You can always come into the library. We do have a family history desk that's staffed weekdays 10 to 3 at the moment, and our information desk is also, can you just put it on the next slide, sorry. And our information desk is available whenever we're open, so you can always come in and visit us. We also have an online inquiry form, so if you submit that an Ask Us inquiry form, that's a way of getting a bit more in-depth research help if you can't come into the library, or if you've been in and you've hit a bit of a brick wall or whatever, and our research librarians will spend about an hour doing research on your behalf. If you've just got a quick question, you can give us a call, or we also have a live chat service on our, you'll see it on our website, so if you've just got a quick question, you can pop in a question that way. And of course, the more that you can tell us about what you're looking for, the better, the more productive our research will be. So we appreciate that it's not possible for some people to provide a lot of detail about their ancestors because they simply don't have that information, but anything about when they lived, where they lived, any towns or missions that they lived in, etc., will help us do a more meaningful search. So I'd like to just thank you for listening today. I hope you get a lot out of the rest of the day, and I wish you the best with your family history journey.
Thank you very much, Suzy. I've just learned a whole lot.
Good.
So you're a natural. Thank you very much. We will see if we've got any questions for you. Are you likely to make records like births accessible digitally, as I am located interstate?
Yeah, so those records are actually owned by the Office of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and in some states they have opted to put them online. In our state, they haven't, so petition the Office of Births, Deaths and Marriages if you want that information publicly accessible.
Okay, and Leanne, they're also available as an index on the Genealogy SA website. You'll see that later on in
That's
Sue
true.
Lear's presentation. Lots of thumbs up. I think that's it.
Great.
Shows how thorough you were. Thank you very much,
Thank
Suzy.
you.
What we'll do now is move on to state records, and we have Andrew Wilson, who you met earlier, and his helper is Rebecca O'Reilly. You may see her appear from the right-hand side occasionally. So I'm going to swap seats with Andrew, and Beck can take Andrew's seat.
Welcome everybody out there. I did as you know, the welcome to country earlier, but I'd like to, for my own personal presentation, do the same to acknowledge that we're on Kaurna country. Okay, so I'm going to talk about records relating to Aboriginal people in the state records of South Australia. So that's who we are. We're in fact the archives for local government in South Australia as well as state government. We provide a lot of services to the public. I'm going to specifically talk about what we hold as far as Indigenous family resources at state records, and at the same time provide some examples of our records and some related stories in terms of people who've done some research. In the general, our collection, we have many records of different government agencies. You might see up on the screen, we've got records that are in our system that are GRG, which is Government Record Group, but we also have GRS records, Government Record Series. Some of the GRG records in terms of where records relating to Aboriginal people or about Aboriginal people include GRG1, the Attorney Generals or State Coroners. We've got Government Office records, we've got the Police Department, Immigration, Public and Tourist Bureau, Education Department, Colonial Secretary's Office, which where in terms of the administration of Aboriginal affairs in South Australia, that's where it all began, the earliest correspondence files relating to Aboriginal people. We've got records of the Lands Department, and without question, we look at GRG 52, which is the old Aborigines Department or Office and successor agencies. And I might just say on that while we hold these records, the current peak Aboriginal body in South Australia responsible for these records that people often need to get access to, particularly restricted records, is Aboriginal Affairs Reconciliation, which is part of the Department of State Planning, and then the last mentioned records where we've identified relating to Aboriginal people correctional services on this slide. In the general, in terms of our records formats regarding Aboriginal history, where information can be found, we've got Aboriginal newspaper clippings. You'll see later in these slides, I'll make an example of one of those. We have photographs relating to Aboriginal people. Our photographs aren't extensive, but they're well indexed, and for those that we have, we can advise people about who they relate to, what communities they relate to, etc. Records all come in the format of documents and letters. That's primarily most of our collection. When we look at the correspondence of Aboriginal affairs, it's the day-to-day records that were created by the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Protection Board and other like bodies that were responsible for the administration of Aboriginal affairs in South Australia. We also have maps and plans, we have volumes and registers. It's just a very general overview. which we can advise more about. This is information taken from a fact sheet entitled Services for Aboriginal People. State records provide services for Aboriginal people in the spirit of reconciliation and in recognition of the individual's right of access to their own personal information. I've attached a link to our website, which for purposes of time we won't go into, but this is something that for those who want to follow through can find this information. Of course, it's being recorded. You can go into the link and find out more about the type of assistance available to access to records relating to Aboriginal people. As the official custodians of records created by state and local government agencies within South Australia, State Records holds a wealth of material documenting the written history and experience of Aboriginal people in the state. These records provide valuable assistance into the research of native title, Aboriginal heritage, reconciliation, family and community history, and can also help members of the stolen generations identify and become reunited with family members they were separated from as a result of past government policies. I'll get straight into our resources and add up front that as people identify information in records, they may not understand the records for reasons, maybe particularly younger generation people who didn't experience or live in an era when certain things impacted Aboriginal people, like the Aboriginal Protection Board. So we've got a valuable resource. We put together this and another one. Resource we created back in 2000, quite a while back, and the one I'm referring to, we're looking at now, is a resource we put together entitled A Little Flower and a Few Blankets, which is an administrative history of Aboriginal affairs in South Australia. Quite a valuable resource to both experienced researchers and the novice researcher. Just in summary of this particular resource, it's a guide to records relating to Aboriginal people in archives. It has a summary of legislation, so we went through a lot of things like government gazettes, parliamentary papers, and looked at anything that legislation that impacted on Aboriginal people, particularly in this state. It has an overview of government policies and practices, also an overview of key departmental figures, for example, the protectors and chief protectors of Aborigines. It has a list of the series or groups of records to help researchers locate records relating to Aboriginal people. And again, that's not just the Aboriginal affairs records. There are many different government agencies where records relating to or about Aboriginal people have been identified. We have a 5-volume guide to records relating to Aboriginal people. This was quite an interesting exercise in the making of this of the guide, in as much as at one point many years ago I went through many of the listings that we physically recorded in writing, the records relating to Aboriginal people identified from many different government agencies. So this 5-volume guide, as you see on the screen, lists thousands of references to individual Aboriginal people, to communities, to families. So we have this index available to make research of our records available. Otherwise, it becomes pretty hit and miss if we didn't have these resources. Very important, a very good cross-section of the records created during or continuing in terms of the ongoing administration of Aboriginal affairs. We have an Aboriginal resource kit. As you can see, it's an introduction to primary sources held by state records relating to Aboriginal people. It includes transcriptions of selected records in chronological order, reflecting many different things about what is or has been the history and experience of Aboriginal people in this state, created over the course of time in the day-to-day administration of Aboriginal affairs. to make this more user-friendly. It also contains an index and many other features. For lack of time, I won't go into now, but people can discover this particular resource, and it's very helpful. It has a number of features to it. This is the other resource I mentioned, alluded to earlier, created in 2020. Over time, we've had a number of Aboriginal people who've used our records, and they voluntarily agreed to tell their stories about their experience, what records they researched, and the value of those records, and the results in terms of what they got out of the records. So this, I should have mentioned up front, our resource is called Distant Voices, using the archives of state records to unlock our Indigenous past. We have a few people on there, as mentioned, who tell their stories, very valuable. We think this brings home the point, so to speak. Rather than tell you, we don't have the time to tell you too much about all our records, but I think by way of stories, the people telling their stories of what they gain from researching at state records into Aboriginal history and experience. The old saying, a picture tells many stories, so that video says a lot. Probably our mainstay in terms of our resources at state records, I believe, all evolves around our Aboriginal Name Index, which we have called AIMS, Aboriginal Information Management System Database. It's a searchable database of the names of Aboriginal people identified in records. Of course, the database itself, we have another specific field which gives a brief description of the detail of information in records that have been discovered, which collectively, as mentioned, in the overall reflect the history and experience of Aboriginal people in South Australia. We've got, this slide needs updating, we've got over 145,000 entries on the database of names of Aboriginal people. So it includes traditional names, nicknames as people were given, and other indicators of like age, sex and location, etc. We've brought it all together in the fields in the database. We have safeguarded some records. We'll put up information that we can search, provide to people without necessarily reflecting what the sensitive information is, but sometimes just a tag that some information is sensitive as a warning and as a means of providing appropriate access without offending people. AIMS also identifies relevant references to Northern Territory records given for an early period of time. South Australia was administratively responsible for the Northern Territory. So that's interesting. We have a special relationship with the Northern Territory. So many Aboriginal people were brought down from the Territory to South Australia, and some of their experiences that in terms of the administration of government, records can be found relating to Aboriginal people who are from the Northern Territory. Now, as mentioned earlier, there's no time to go through much, if at all, of the type of records what we hold. One of the type of records we do have is that under the Aborigines Act of 1911, there was an assimilation policy in 1951, which was all repealed when the Aborigines Act came to an end in 1963 and replaced by an Aboriginal Affairs Act. But during that time that I spoke of, the Aborigines Act and the assimilation policy, there was a system of exemptions where what you're looking at here on the screen is a blank unconditional exemption form, and these are copies, in fact, of exactly the certificates that were handed to Aboriginal people who obtained exemption. We'll just go to the next slide. I'll explain a bit more. What we have here from a book that my mother put together from the Tyndale collection, working with the Tyndale collection at the South Australian Museum, Aboriginal family histories of Aboriginal people on the west coast of South Australia. My mum included in that, and this is what the Aborigines Protection Board. This was an exemption certificate for my grandmother, and you can see that as people obtained certificates, there was provision on the certificates for their photographs, and so people are interested that we have a cross-section of only of a number of the exemption certificates handed out to Aboriginal people. Not people can contact us and find out if family members, some of those we have copies of as exemption certificates for. We have Aboriginal newspaper clippings. These are 3 men from Point Macleay. This is relative to an act of government that the South Australian government wanted to bring about or legislate back in 1923. The act was going to be entitled the Training and Education of Aboriginal Children Act 1923. Talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. We'll just get back to it. Not there? Not there. Okay. All right. Don't know how that happened, but we did an exhibition at the State Library, which ran for a number of months, and we did a feature story about these 3 gentlemen opposing the Training and Education of Aboriginal Children Act. Quite emotional. Of course, while on the surface it sounds a good thing, the training and education of Aboriginal children, in order for that to happen, meant the removal of Aboriginal children from families. So this was strongly opposed, and because of this representation to government, this petition to government by these 3 gentlemen, in fact the petition itself was wrote up by another gentleman at Point Macleay. It stopped at that time for that act going ahead, but unfortunately a lot of what government wanted in terms of their purposes did in fact see the removal of Aboriginal children happen anyway at a later point, but this is a significant period where the expressions of Aboriginal people, which was not only impacted on people at Point Macleay, but other Aboriginal missions in South Australia, at least stopped that momentum of child removal at that time. I'd like to mention that we understand that not everyone can come into state records, so we have an Aboriginal outreach program. Just in budget order, you'll see on the screen some of the places we've visited over time. The Iron Triangle, so that was Port Pirie, Port Augusta, Whyalla. Then, of course, Udnadatta, Port Lincoln, Gerard, Wamawara Mission on the outskirts of Port Augusta. In the southeast, we visited Kingston, Millicent, Naracoorte, Mount Gambier. We visited Point Pearce at Murray Bridge and Port Pirie. If you just go back a second, the image you see in the middle, some of these outreach events, I've done up a board of some of the historical pieces of information identified and left with the community. You can see more to the right side of the screen. I mentioned we'd visited Point Pearce, so there's a reflection of that. The lower one was when I visited at Port Pirie. Now we understand, I mentioned earlier, that when people get exposed to records, that there needs a lot of context around those records, whether that's political, historical, legislative. We have a number of resources you can see on the screen that have been specially selected secondary sources that in terms of understanding our records, working with them, giving them some context. You can see for yourself what those secondary sources are, which we have available in our research centre for people to look at. Where I'd like to end, I think it's very important that we understand exactly what the significance of our records are. People have different reasons they're doing research. Now, some years ago, I met this lady, Suzy Sultan, and you'll see over on the screen, the top right-hand side, a lady by the name of Kathy Bradley, a younger white woman. Suzy and Kathy met each other at through the Whale Reconciliation group. They had it running up there, and as a result, Kathy agreed to help Suzy with her life story. Part of Suzy's story was that, and she was from the Whale area, was that her three oldest siblings were removed from her family before she herself was born, and they come in a couple of times. I got to know about their research a bit more clearly, what they were looking for. I sat them down at my desk. I rang this gentleman in Victoria who was the step-grandson of the Chief Protectors of Aborigines, W.G. South, who was a protector of Aborigines between 1908 and 1918. And this gentleman I called while having these two ladies sit down with me at my desk. He had been across the state records a number of times over the years researching his step-grandfather as Chief Protector of Aborigines, including who were many of the children that he had removed under his protectorship in terms of administering the 1911 Aborigines Act in South Australia. Within minutes, he was able to come back to us with information relative to all three of her siblings. Suzy, in putting her book together, was able to, was a very important part to, I guess, as a healing process to have this information to give some closure to her healing and provide information ongoing for family. I went up to the launch in Whale and remained friends with Suzy until her passing. So that's just one of many examples, but a very significant example of people researching our records and the value of that information, how it impacted, was able, in this case, to help Suzy with closure about her family. That's my presentation. So if there's any questions, well, there's my details people can take up quickly. Whether there's any questions or answers now, we'll find out. But thank you for allowing me to present today, and hope you got some value from it.
Well, we have no questions that need answering. They've been looked after. And chat is all praise. Look at this. Nice work, Andrew.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm learning so much. We are recording this webinar, thank goodness, because I want to go back and watch it several times over. And what we will do is, at some point in time, make it available and send you all the link to it. What we will do now is take a lunch break. We'll take half an hour or thereabouts and come back at 12:40 p.m. Adelaide time and adjust your clocks accordingly. So we will stop for now and come back then. So have a good break. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We are back live and I think we're on time nearly. So what we'd like to do now is introduce Sue Lear she is the president of the South Australia Genealogy and Heraldry Society Incorporated. They prefer to go by the name Genealogy SA because it's much shorter and easier to say. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Sue and she will start teaching you about the Genealogy SA collection. Thank you. Yeah. And I'll be sitting as Sue's comedy sidekick in case, or for when we get to the exciting bit on the website. All yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I would also like to acknowledge our First Nations people and particularly the folk of the Kaurna, the elders of the Kaurna Nation. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is Genealogy SA's records and how we use them for research. I cannot identify, I'll say up front, I can't identify Aboriginal records specifically. They are woven through all of our records within the society, but we do have a project about to get underway, which will hopefully over the next few months be able to identify more easily the Aboriginal collection within our collections. Okay, next screen. I'm going to...
Sorry about that, Sue.
That's all right. Just going to give you a little bit of information about the society. We've been in existence for almost 50 years. We've provided thousands of records, South Australian, international, for researchers all around the world as well as locally. Our collections have been built up as a result of field trips and collaboration with the registrars of birth, deaths and marriages over the years, and it's been gradually a gradual process of compiling databases from many, many sources. We're a bit like magpies. We just try and gather together as much information as we possibly can. But the most important of that is working with the registrar. South Australia is currently the only state where access to BDM records has been made possible by the work of volunteers. And SAG's volunteers have indexed and collated years of birth, death and marriage historical records. On the left, you can see the sorts of records that we have. That's just a very small snapshot of the types of records that we do have within our collection. So birth, marriage, death, of course, cemetery records, and that includes not only burial records from the various funeral directors, but also a huge collection of gravestones and so forth. Parish records, district records, shipping passenger lists and so on. You can see it all there. So there's some of the thousands of headstones, images of them photographed by our volunteers over the years and now held in the SAG cemetery collection. In the background, which is probably not all that clear to you, is the type of burial record that you could find within our collections, and we draw on those primary records to add to our databases. This is some of the types of records that we do have. There's some school records, destitute asylum records, Adelaide hospital records, parish records. There's just such a rich collection of information, data about people here in South Australia. We do have some interstate records as well, but only a small part of our collection. I'm going to ask Emily, who's my sidekick, to show you just what the SAG's website looks like, and we'll do a live search within the website from the database. And this is through a members, I hasten to add, this is through a members subscription. This is not non-members, and non-members will get much less, but will see the same sort of screens, except part of it's blocked out. Because we're a membership organisation, we have about 4,500 members, so membership is what keeps us afloat and allows us to provide this information for family history researchers. So we're going to have a quick look at, we've talked about Everard or Everett, he's known as both in the records, Sumner, who Nick talked about earlier today. So we're going to have a look at his birth registration. So, and over to the side. So we come down, and this is the type of information, if you have got just a little bit of knowledge of a family member, that you can see within the records. And so we can see that his father is John Sumner, or was John Sumner, and his mother is Rebecca Giles. Now, Rebecca is actually known by two other names. They had 13 children, and her name varies a little bit with the middle children and comes back to Rebecca Giles later. And so it's one of the things that can trip you up as a genealogist if you're just looking for one specific name. Okay, I think we stop now and go back. Okay, the next screen. This is how we did collect, and we do still have information. Get rid of Rachel's. We still have our card records, card catalogue records. We still have microfiche because the very earliest records were collected by microfiche or filmed, microfiche and microfilm, and one of the ubiquitous microfiche readers there on the right-hand side. So when you come into the society, this is the type for older records, this is the type of information that will, if you're looking for primary sources, this is the sort of material and records that you will be looking at. What you can see online is what our volunteers have transcribed and digitised, and so it is a much easier way of accessing. But if you want to get back to the primary records and get a feel for what where these records were taken from, you can see these from the microfiche in particular. Parish records especially are on, and some of the district records, but parish records are particularly on microfiche. Okay. Well, currently we're working with trying to provide as much as we can in the way of digital copies and collaborating with lots of different organisations that we go out into the community quite a bit. And encourage people to work with us, collaborate with us. And this is especially important for community groups, which it just means that they can get a digitised copy of their records. And we have memorandums of understanding with everyone whom we worked with. And so we work with a community group such as MyLaw or My Palonga History groups. And once the agreements are in place and everyone understands how we're going to operate, we have groups of our volunteers who are especially trained in scanning, and we'll take the portable scanners out to those sites. We don't try to bring in original records to the society. At least most of the time anyway, because it's much better to leave them in their original place. And those records then are, as I say, digitised, and we provide a copy of everything that we've digitised. The images will go back to that organisation, and they have a copy, and we also have a copy for the society, and from that we index the records. And they eventually are transformed into the databases that you see. And something like we've just seen for Mr. Sumner. As I say, it enables the compiling of online databases, which can eventually be accessed from our website, collaboration with cultural and community groups, and that's so successful now. The word's got around. Word of mouth is very powerful. We now have a waiting list for projects, working with state records, the registrar and other government departments to index records. Running online, in-person classes, one-on-one family history courses. We're about to undergo or deliver, should I say, some webinars, and hopefully we'll be able to run those once or twice a month on various topics that are really relevant to family history researchers. It's important that we form partnerships with diverse groups so that precious records are not lost. For example, we're working with the Theory Society, Arts Theatre, Masonic Lodges, AIATSIS Museum, Sandful, and of course various churches. Just a few images of what it looks like when our folk go out into the community and do these outreach projects. So some people at Uniting Church at Black Forest, it was a bit earlier this year. What it looks like on the screen when some of the records, like the early Adelaide Hospital records, were transcribed. So we have the original handwriting there on the left-hand side. And what it ends up looking like when we then transcribe it. And then it is checked, it is triple checked, so that by different people each time, so that we can ensure that those records that have been transcribed are correct. So we're very, very careful about transcribing and getting correct records. You can see some images there of the type of thing that we do scan. So lots of photographs, which are so important, and we talked about that earlier today. Nick talked about it in his presentation, as did Rachel from Lutheran Archives and also from the State Library. So very important to be able to bring through some of those images. And books, as you can see down there, the Cooper Stores records, which are just a rich source of social history, what people were buying, how often they were buying, the sorts of prices of those items at that particular time. I think that's 1920s, a mortgage document. Just lots and lots of varied items, whatever is within the records of a organisation, and they are willing for us to be able to digitise, then we'll certainly have copies of them. So there's a little bit of a case study for Everett Luke Sumner using some of our records. He was the youngest of 13 children, so by going to the website, as we just did to show you his birth records, I could also discover that he was the youngest of 13 kids, 7 boys and 6 girls, and parents are John Sumner and Rebecca Giles, also known by 2 other names, and Robinson was also spelt as Robertson as well. So very complicated in trying to ensure that you have the correct people. But the father was consistent through all of that, and the mother's name was always Rebecca. So we'll be pretty sure that these children were all part of that family, and they were all born at Point Macleay between March 1874 and June 1896. So that'll just gives you a little bit of an insight into what you can discover in our records. Now, Nick alluded to this and showed you some of Everett Sumner's military records. I discovered that there was over 120 pages of records in just one file for Everett. So they're a rich source, and we draw, as a family historian, you draw on whatever sources you can find to add to the story and build a picture of that person's life. And so that's what I've done here to show you. This is not within SAG's records, but this, as a family historian, is what you do. You start with the birth and work through and try and find as much information as you possibly can about the person. As you can see there's the birth records for Everett. His death records, we had his death records within our society records. I found where he was buried in West Terrace Cemetery, so the exact position where he is at West Terrace and the details of when he was buried and so forth. And also using another source, of course, going to Trove, that favourite spot to find out all sorts of stories. I thought that was an interesting little snippet there about Everett supposedly being perhaps dead and body floating in the lake, but it wasn't at all. It was just a suitcase that had been stolen from him and dumped in the Torrens. But just a little bit more. So the future for genealogy, looking ahead, we aim to work with as many like-minded organisations as possible to bring technology and education and knowledge for family history to as many family researchers in the wider community as we possibly can. As I said before, we're currently almost 4,500 membership, and very proud to say we're the biggest family history organisation or society in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment. I'm sure we'll get overtaken by another later on, but at the moment we have just gathered together so much information that it has become well known amongst the genealogy community that we're a good source for information. And so COVID's been particularly good for us in that instance, where people have been home doing their research and have joined up, and so that they can find out more information. Rural engagement is another goal that we're working towards, working with all sorts of partnerships, use of technology via Zoom. We've done a tremendous amount of Zoom sessions, YouTube and other media to reach a wider audience, and increasing the capacity for scanning workshops. As I said before, we have just over 300 volunteers, but they are scattered across a whole range of projects within the society and within our library. So coming into the resource centre on Unley Road, you will find that there will be volunteers in there who can help you with your research, particularly if it's a specialist area. It's really good to ring up beforehand and see if there is someone who has got expertise in that particular area to come in, and when you come in, that you can work with that particular person, because you'll get much more value for your time. Of course, going on and increasing our digital collections, so important. We have coming up to 10 million records, but that's scattered, well, not scattered, but it is across a broad and diverse range of topics, and so we're always looking to add to that. I hasten to say that we're not in competition with any of the government or cultural organisations. We see ourselves as collaborating and being complementary. So if you're looking for information, you're going to the State Library, you're going to State Records, you come to us. and of course to Linkup if you're from the Aboriginal community and looking for connections there. So it's not a one-stop shop. It is simply another element to help you on your way to discover your family journey. We're working widely with interstate and overseas family groups, and we look to do that more and more now to make more data available locally. So international collaboration is an aim for the future. We're a not-for-profit. This is a bit of, a marketing bit for me at the moment for our society, how you can get involved. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We don't receive any government funding. We're memberships subscription-based and funded. As I said, about 4,500 members, 300 at least volunteers. And with these resources, we've been able to achieve amazing results and make available millions of records. We're working with, as I've talked about before, partners such as the Library, National Archives, History Trust, State Records, and many other community groups. We really encourage and look to work with these groups. So we're looking very much to collect, preserve, and provide access to all of our family stories, and particularly your family history.
And that's you.
And that's me.
Thank you very much, Sue. Let's check if we've got any questions before you run away. Our questions have been answered. Nope, I think we're all good. Thanks, Sue.
Terrific.
And we've got lots of thank yous coming through again. All right.
Okay.
You can run away now.
I can run away now.
Thanks, everybody. What we will do now is, by the magic of Zoom, we've got Donna-Maree Towney from AIATSIS joining us. I need to disconnect and I need to find Donna-Maree. Excuse me a moment, everybody. I'm just searching for Donna. Donna-Maree should appear in a moment. Now, something that I don't think Genealogy SA probably pushed was their ability to research on your behalf. They have a paged research service as well. So, okay, Donna-Maree is now with us. She's currently on mute. So, Donna-Maree, you need to enable your camera and unmute your microphone. You're unmuted.
Hello.
Hello. We meet face to face finally.
How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Now,
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there.
No worries. We
could blame COVID for everything, can't we?
Blame COVID for that one, yes.
Definitely.
If you'd like to share your presentation now, we'll hand over to you.
Lovely, thank you. Are you seeing anything yet?
We are. If you can go into slideshow mode, will be...
Yep, I know what to do, yeah. Just it takes a few seconds to come up. How's that?
Perfect. Thanks, Donna-Maree.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're all getting good at this technology, even though I still think I need lots of lessons. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal traditional owners of the land I live and work on, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank them for their continual custodianship of unceded land, and extend that acknowledgement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, and that this was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Donna-Maree Towney. I'm a Gunditjmara woman and Director of Collection Access and Support at AIATSIS. I manage two teams, the Collection Access team, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, researchers and those who have an interest in the AIATSIS collection can access materials for their personal and or research use. And the other team I manage, which I'm going to talk about today, is the Family History team and the work we do to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, sorry about that, who have been or are still impacted by past government policies that forcibly remove children and who are now searching for their family. Okay, I'd just like to provide a warning that there are some images of Aboriginal people that may have died. So I'll give you some background around AIATSIS. AIATSIS sits on beautiful Ngunnawal country on the edge of the famous Lake Burley-Griffin, and yes, it actually does look like that on some days. Although we reside on Ngunnawal country, AIATSIS is an Australian government statutory authority which was established under the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act in 2013. We sit within the portfolio of the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and our responsible minister is Minister Wyatt, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. We tell the story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia and create opportunities for people to encounter, engage and be transformed by that story. We support and facilitate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural resurgence, and we shape our national narrative. And we care for a growing collection of more than 1 million items, and I'll talk more about that shortly. The AIATSIS journey began 60 years ago when a group of non-Indigenous academics met at the Australian National University to discuss the state of Aboriginal studies in Australia. Anthropologist Professor W.E.H. Stanner, we actually have a room named after him in AIATSIS, recommended a national institute to record Aboriginal cultures, and I quote, before those traditions perished in the face of European ways. Through an Act of Parliament, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies began, and in 1970, Philip Roberts became the first Aboriginal member appointed to the AIAS Council. And in 1970, Senator Neville Bonner, the second council member, was both reflecting a growing pressure for more Aboriginal representation within the institute. In 1989, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies became the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies with a new act. It sees a reduced council to 9 members with a mandatory minimum of 5 members being Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. In 2020, AIATSIS named its building Maraga, a Ngunnawal word for a strong, robust shield. AIATSIS delivers a number of programs, which includes family history. We have the Return of Cultural Heritage program, which works with our communities to return materials from overseas governments, collecting institutions and private collectors. The Indigenous Research Exchange aims to improve outcomes by ensuring greater involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in setting research priorities, leading research projects, and determining the appropriate collection and use of data about communities. The AIATSIS Education Strategy 2021 to 25 aims to develop and implement a schools program that generates world-leading education resources aligned to the Australian curriculum, and to develop and deliver a culturally responsive professional learning outcome for educators. The AIATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research ensures that with and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people follows a meaningful engagement and mutual benefit between researchers and individuals and or communities involved in research. The AIATSIS Research Ethics Committee is responsible for reviewing projects involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. The Native Title Research and Access Service assists to undertake catalogue searches and listing within the AIATSIS collection. For over 50 years, AIATSIS has been the custodian of a unique and special collection which includes works by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists, filmmakers, storytellers, writers, academic and research materials. The art and object collection includes over 6,000 items, books and printed materials, which includes 175,680 titles, 3,740 serial titles, and more than 18,000 books, including 4,000 rare items. AIATSIS looks after 5,000 video titles and over 6.8 million feet of film and over 700,000 photographs relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people dating back to the late 1800s and over 40,000 hours of audio. The collection can be accessed via our website, the Mura catalogue, and also we're here to help you, and you can submit an online web form that will allow you to put what you are looking for and submit your form, and one of our friendly team will be able to help you. Family history research began in the 1970s with the purpose to provide family history research support and assistance for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to learn about their family history and heritage. Over the past 3 years, the program has been funded by the National Indigenous Australian Agencies, or NIAA, to deliver family history research support nationally. Its intention is to assist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people impacted by forcible removal policies. We have a team of about 5 people who receive about 100 inquiries per month from the public who are looking for their families. AIATSIS recognises that past government policies has had and continues to have a devastating impact on the social and emotional wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we work to deliver a program that is culturally safe. Our team is 100% Aboriginal employees with male and female staff who are dedicated to easing the impacts we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have experienced. Many of our clients have never seen or have no reflection of what their family look like or have heard their voices or know their stories. The family history team has been able to provide over 900 items from the collection to assist bringing them home. Our program is free and we work very closely with our clients to find their families. Family history team provides 3 types of support. There is self-help research and funded research. The self-help, we have a comprehensive family history toolkit that Karen alluded to this morning. Thank you, Karen. With templates and resources to help you along the way. These are available on our website, which includes a list of state-by-state sources to help you find your family's records. And there is the 1800 help desk number to call when you hit roadblocks. For research, once you have exhausted all avenues of the guided self-help, we can undertake research on your behalf. AIATSIS has a number of MOUs with other government agencies and organisations that we can access that could hold information about your family. For funded research, if you are unable to undertake or complete your own research, you may be elderly or don't have access to a computer, you could access a funded researcher to assist you. Once all the research has been completed, we provide a comprehensive report to our clients, which we hope connects people to their family. When it is safe to do so, you, your family and communities are most welcome to come and visit us at AIATSIS. We are located on the beautiful Acton Peninsula on Nunkuwarrin country. We can provide you a tour of the collection, and if you wish, we can even look in the collection to see if we are taking care of any of the materials that are relative to you and your family, or we can assist you with your family history research journey. And there's all our contact details there. It was a very short, quick one, noting that after lunch sometimes it gets a little bit tricky to listen to long discussions, but I'm very pleased to be able to be here with you all today and tell you a little bit about AIATSIS.
Thank you so much, Donna-Maree.
Thank you.
We were all saying how beautiful the location that your AIATSIS building is.
Would you like, can you still see my screen?
Yeah, oh, there we go.
I'll put it up for you. It's stunning. I took an amazing photo the other day. It was all the mountains on the background were covered in snow.
Oh, wow. Oh,
I should have posted it. Sorry, I should have put that one up because it was quite spectacular. But yeah, it is absolutely stunning. It's a lovely place to work. Yeah, we're very lucky.
And I'm just seeing if we've got any questions. Let's see. Q&A. And our chat. No, I think it's all been answered in chat. So what we'll do is You can find more AIATSIS detail in the fact sheet that we posted in the chat earlier on today. We'll post it again at the end of the session as well, and email a link to you all when we send out the recording. So Donna-Maree, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And
I hope it was useful. There's so much information that we could provide, and I thought it might be nice to hear what AIATSIS does, and that all our work is around supporting our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we're all connected in some way in the work that we do. So I think it's important to have an opportunity to talk about the organisation as a whole, but how it also supports this really important work that we're doing in terms of supporting our brothers and sisters and cousins in finding their family.
Yep, it's essential.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to go back to screen sharing. And we're going to bring back Karen George. So I'm going to fast forward through here a bit. And here we go. So I'm going to hand over to Karen, and she's going to give us a poll of hints and tips on online searching. So I'm going to hand back to Karen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you to Donna-Maree. It was awesome I just actually vagued out in our little green room listening to you and thought, oh dear, I'm on. But I wanted to correct a couple of things that I missed. I think I was so moved by Uncle Klynton, Wanganeen and Andrew Wilson sitting together here that I forgot to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on today as the Kaurna country. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. And also to all Aboriginal people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening today online. I also want to mention that in this bit of my presentation, there will be some images of Aboriginal people who have passed, so making you aware of that. And also that we do have Uncle Moogie Sumner's permission for us to show some of the records related to Everett Luke Sumner. So off we go, a little bit about what else you can do if you've stuck at home in lockdown or wherever and do some online searching, or you've sort of exhausted going to physical places. You can play around online and see what you can find. So compared to, say, even just 10 years ago, there's so much more information available online which can help you in your Aboriginal family history research. You've been introduced to a number of record holders and have seen ways in which you can search their collections online. For most of these agencies, including State Records, the State Library, Genealogy SA, there are counterparts in other states and territories. These are pretty findable by just using Google. So if you just put State Archives New South Wales, State Records Western Australia, those kinds of things, you'll find those sites and you'll be able to navigate around. And there's generally on those sites, there's an ask a librarian or ask an archivist. So if you get stuck, you can always do that. Similarly on AIATSIS, as Donna-Maree said, there's lots of places, even that 1-800 number, to call up if you do get stuck. So online searching and family history research, as all of us, I guess, have alluded to, is really about lateral thinking. If you can't find the information in one place, just use your brain to think about where else you might be able to look. If you don't have the full story, think about ways you might be able to find out more. So Sue already talked a little bit about one of her favourite websites, but I say it's one of my absolute favourites as well, which is the Trove website, which is the National Library of Australia's gateway to information held in repositories across Australia and available online. So it includes just about everything: books, articles, government gazettes, photographs, sound and video recordings, old websites. You can get back to a sort of way back type of thing where you go to look at websites as they existed at different times, which is really valuable as well. But one of the most valuable searchable resources on Trove are the thousands of digitised newspapers, Australian newspapers, which date from the mid-1800s and mostly go up to 1954, but some go beyond with special arrangement. And all the resources on Trove can be keyword searched, which is really useful as well. So Trove is a massively wonderful resource for searching for family members in information about family members in different places at different times, or for information about missions, institutions, pastoral stations, all sorts of different things that you might find to pad out your family history. I didn't do the clever thing that Suzy from the library did, which was actually go out to websites, but I might get lost in there and you'll never get to go home. So I thought I'd do some snapshots. You can always do a little Google for Trove yourself, and it will be the first thing that comes up if you put the word Trove, and you'll find this is the search box at the top. So it's always important to think about the ways to search on Trove, enter your search terms into that main search box. I don't go to the newspapers or the different categories, I whack it into that main search box there. Then you'll find everything that relates to the person or place that you're putting into that. There's lots of different ways that you can do a keyword search to help you get better results. And these kind of little searching tips operate across most platforms that you're looking for online. So if you're searching for a name, you know, if you put in Betty Masters, I've just made up that name, if you put in Betty Masters without the quote marks around it, you'll get thousands of millions of Bettys and thousands of millions of Masters. By putting those quote marks around that name, you're looking for those two words close to each other. And also, I think Sue and most of us have mentioned that you have to be really, again, lateral in the spelling of names and in the variations of how a person is going to be referred to. So with the name Betty, there's Elizabeth, there's Beth, there's multiple ways. There could be a different spelling of Masters. So play around with that spelling, because a lot of times things weren't written down necessarily well, and lots of different misspellings have crept through into the record. If you're searching for information about Aboriginal people in a certain location, you can use the conjunction AND, capital AND, so that I put that example there, Pinaroo and Aboriginal, if you're looking for information about Aboriginal people in that area. You can also combine those, so you can have your Betty Masters with their brackets and Aboriginal and Pinaroo. When you look at Trove, you'll see along the side that you can actually refine those results. So you can refine it by state and territory, you can refine it by decade, year, month, and you can refine it down if you're interested in a specific newspaper. On the Trove website, you'll also find lots of how to use Trove searching tips and little videos on that you can have a look at, which will help you to navigate that website. Sue had a little screenshot of some of the things that she'd found on Trove in relation to Everett Luke Sumner. So I'm going to just go a little bit more detail into some of those. So when I did my search for Everett Luke Sumner using his full name, I picked up a similar article to the one that Sue found. There's lots of versions of this, because in the past, a story that was interesting was picked up by multiple newspapers. So you may see the same story appeared in the Adelaide Advertiser, might have appeared in the Perth Advertiser or some other place. So this is the article that I found, which similarly tells that story of how the suitcase was found in the river and they assumed that it was related to a body, but it wasn't in this case. So I won't read that full article out to you, but you can see the information that's in there. What is interesting for us in terms of the helping people find Aboriginality if they don't know about it, some of the language that's used in these articles, such as that word, which I'm not going to use, starting with an H, that will identify the person that you're looking for as an Aboriginal person. So that may be something that is really meaningful to someone who does not know anything about their Aboriginality, and then they can come across an article and there they go. They know that their ancestor was an Aboriginal person. What's interesting is this, I only found 3 articles when I put in Everett Luke Sumner. When I decided to put it in different, I just left out his middle name. I put just Everett Sumner. I found a whole lot more. I found another one of the same story with that headline, "I'm not drowned." So that you can find more with varying your research terms. One thing I found, and I talked about this earlier, is the derogatory nature of the way that Aboriginal people were spoken about in the past. As we know from what has been shown by National Archives, Everett Luke Sumner was a World War I veteran. So rather than being referred to as a World War I veteran, he's referred to as lounging around in the square. So that really, I found that offensive myself, because I'm guaranteeing if it had been a non-Aboriginal person, they would have been referred to as Private so-and-so who served on the Western Front or whatever. So just be aware that that kind of stuff is going to creep into anything that you see. And in that way, it's, you know, it's a double-edged sword, because these are the kind of things that actually allow you to find out about Aboriginal history, but you have to put up with that kind of attitude. What's really interesting is the connections that you can make between records. And Nick and Sue both showed bits and pieces from Everett Sumner's military records. So when I was going through those and also looking at that article, I found it really interesting. Even though the dates don't quite match up, Everett did put in a statutory declaration about the fact that his kit bag had been stolen and he'd lost his discharge papers. So whether those two stories are connected would need further research, but I thought it was really interesting that they kind of backed each other up about him losing his material. I did another search on Trove too with the Everett Sumner, and I found quite an interesting article which pops up, and it was a reminiscence kind of thing. Smith's Weekly, I assume, I don't know particularly much about. That's kind of a weekly magazine, so it had like a centre page type spread with reminiscences of the First World War. And so this popped up, if you're reading through to the bottom, it was about some soldiers being trapped in a sort of bunker, being surrounded by Germans and being fired at, but then a Lewis gunner, South Australian by the name of Everett Sumner, which you can see at the bottom of that article, used his Lewis gun and he cleared up the whole problem and they were able to get back safely. Now, it may or may not be our Everett Sumner, but the thing that clinches it for me, it says that the company of the 32nd Battalion. So I went back to the military records and thought, oh, let's just check out what his battalion was, and that was his battalion. So this is a kind of reminiscence, and it would be really interesting. It makes me want to go and look at war diaries and other things to see, you know, and further into his military records to see more about this particular incident, to chase that up. So that's another way you find information, but it's kind of a little bit, I guess, not referenced, so you need to do further research to find more out about it. Okay. The other place I just went to find information was I just Googled Everett Sumner. And because of this article, I kind of went, you know what, I'll Google Everett Sumner and Lewis Gunner, or Everett Sumner and Gunner, or Everett Sumner and 32nd Battalion. So multiple different arrangements of those things that I'd found through these articles, and to see what I found. And I was able to find records held by AIATSIS, I was able to find records held by the War Memorial, and I was also able to find records held by the Red Cross. I'm not going to go into all of those today, and they were shown by the various other people who've been speaking to you today. But the point I'm making is that it's good to use one record that you find, use little clues and examples from that to go as a searching tool to see what else you can find. And Google, you know, Google is your friend. I really said today, chatting to Klynton in the foyer, nothing is too silly in family history. Just type whatever you want into Google related to your family, and you might be very surprised what pops up. I'm going to talk a little bit about other ways to find birth, death, marriage type records online. So Sue's talked about the material that they hold and the wonderful database that they have, which literally we at Linkup use on a daily basis, because it helps us to find what information is available, and particularly their listings of not only the birth, death, marriage indexes, but the things that appear in newspapers. Because newspaper death notices and funeral notices are really valuable, because of course they mention the names of family members. So the Ryson Index is an interesting one which I use quite a lot. It's a free online index. And I've got to do a shout out to all those volunteers, including all those at Genealogy SA, that do these jobs for absolutely nothing, just for the love of doing it and wanting to put information out there. So the Ryson Index is basically run by volunteers who volunteer to index death and funeral notices in Australian newspapers. And they date back from 1803 to the present. So you can actually, if you've got nothing to do, you can get a job, a volunteer job indexing a newspaper. They often put call-outs for volunteers. It began in New South Wales, so it has a little bit of a bias towards the eastern states, but now all the other states are involved. It's very useful for identifying if and when family members have died. Once you've found a death notice and have the name and date of the newspaper, you can then go to the state library or check to see whether it has copies of that newspaper on microfilm or hard copy. If it precedes about 1954, you might then be able to find that death notice on Trove. So I did a search for Everett Sumner in Ryson. when I did Everett Luke Sumner, nothing at all came up. So I just tried Everett Sumner. And interestingly, Sue alluded to the fact that there was another Everett Sumner that pops up quite often when you're doing some searching, and that's Everett Wiltshire Sumner. But as you can see, because he passed away in 1971, sorry, he passed away in 2001 at the age of 71, that shows that he isn't our Everett Sumner. He is a different one, and he was born in the 30s. But looking at the genealogies, and in fact, Doreen Kartinyeri's genealogy, you can see how he is connected to that family. Another resource which is part of the State Library collection is the Seville Index to Death and Funeral Notices. So this was started by a fellow with the surname Seville. He started it back in the 70s. He recently retired and has been handed over to the State Library, but it's a free online index to death and funeral notices that are published in the South Australian Advertiser newspaper. It's just a basic keyword search once you get in there. It's really simple to use, but it's very valuable again because it lets you know whether there is a death and or funeral notice for a family member. Once you find that there is a funeral notice, you can go to that paper, you can find out who the funeral director was. And if you are trying to find a grave or you're trying to make contact with living family members, funeral directors can sometimes pass on a letter. You might be able to write a letter saying that you're connected to the person that they organised the funeral for, and would this letter be able to be passed on to the family because you'd like to make contact. So when you're actually trying to make physical contact with people you found, that is one way you can go. So death and funeral notices can reveal where a family member was buried. So there are a lot of online sites that you can use to search for burial places. Headstones and memorial inscriptions also provide further information about family just by reading those headstones. And there's a lot of volunteers out there too who have gone to their local cemeteries and photographed headstones. So through these two cemetery sites that I'm showing you here, you might have a gateway to those collections as well. And these people are very generous. In the past, we found that there have been photographs of particular headstones, emailed the person, and immediately comes back the photograph of the headstone to pass on to family. These are the two that I use a lot, the Australian Cemeteries website and the Australian Cemeteries Index. They allow for searches of cemetery and burial records across all states and territories. So I did a search, which Sue has already shown you the result of finding out where Everett Luke Sumner was buried. So I did a search for him on the Australian Cemeteries Index to find the same information that she did, which shows that he was, if you look just at the bottom there, he's buried at the West Terrace Cemetery. Most capital cities have a cemeteries authority, which is responsible for the major urban cemeteries. These websites allow for online searching. The Adelaide Cemeteries Authority allows for searching of 4 of Adelaide's larger cemeteries, the Enfield Memorial Park, the Cheltenham Cemetery, Smithfield Memorial Park and West Terrace Cemetery. So with Everett Luke Sumner, knowing that he was buried in the West Terrace Cemetery, I then went to the Australian Cemeteries Authority website and did a bit of a search to find him and found the same information that Sue did. You can see the mark around the Sumner grave. But what's really interesting here as well is that in this same plot, Everett Luke Sumner is in there, but also the other Sumner that we found, Everett Wiltshire Sumner, is also in that same plot, as you can see. You can click across, there's one of one. And so you'll find that in many of these burial sites, there is more than one person interred. So this made me starting to think, because I hadn't done a huge amount of research on the connection between these two men. So if you did find this connection between two people as you're doing your family history research, that's where you go to the material that Klynton was talking about, the genealogical material that's been recorded over time with Aboriginal people contributing that massive genealogical knowledge that they have inside their heads. Someone, I think, asked a question about whether we'd be talking more about the Tyndale genealogies. As we don't have the museum representative here today, can't go into great detail, but I can tell you a little bit about those records, which is among some of the records here. There's a lot of other material at the South Australian Museum, but it's probably best known for the Tyndale genealogies. So one of the ways to find out this information, if you haven't got access to the work that was done later by Doreen Kartinyeri, the actual physical volumes of their genealogies, you can go back to the original source. So Doreen was, as Klynton said, was one of the pioneers of the Aboriginal Family History Unit at South Australian Museum, which was established in 1987. In that role, she worked along with Tyndale. She wrote to him and contacted him to work to update and correct the records that he had recorded. So Tyndale worked alongside the University Board for Anthropological Research, which was a group of scientists from the University of Adelaide that travelled across Australia during the period 1920s to the 1970s. The most important thing that Tyndale did is he sat down, as you can see in this beautiful photograph of him in the Warburton Ranges in Warburton in Western Australia, sitting down with elders, chatting to them. You see he's got his pencil in his hand, and he's more than likely sitting there recording genealogies. These were accompanied often by photographs and further information collected about those individuals. The South Australian genealogies that were recorded during the 1938-39 expedition, which was a joint expedition between Harvard and Adelaide universities, those genealogies have been indexed in a guide called Mapping Family. The museum indexed this. This is a very important resource for researching South Australian Aboriginal family history. So I'm going to show you, at the bottom you can see there I did a search. You can download Mapping Family from the Family History Unit section of the South Australian Museum website, and you can do a search of the PDF of names. And I popped up with Everett Sumner and Everett Wiltshire Sumner, and it's actually, you can see it's spelt Wilshire, so they've got another variation on the spelling there. I was at the South Australian Museum just the other day, and I asked whether they could just pop that genealogy up for me so I could have a look what was on it. And it's quite a detailed genealogy, lots and lots of writing on it. And you can see off to the side that the Everett without the Luke is actually our Everett Luke Sumner. So that's a good resource. And there's also resources for Western Australia and also for Queensland online, and probably a way to go to look for those would be by asking AIATSIS or just Googling Western Australian Tyndale genealogies, Queensland Tyndale genealogies. I know the Western Australian one is an online, so you can do searching online, whereas I've seen the Queensland one more as a physical guide. But look into that if you are zooming into us from other states and territories. Many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were removed from family and placed in institutional or foster care. Stolen generation survivors, this is the way that they were removed and put into those institutions, as Klynton and also Suzy Russell has talked about. If you are aware that one of your family members spent time in out-of-home care, you may want to apply for those surviving records. But to do so, you might need to know more about the institution, you know, that your ancestor was placed in. Where was it located? Who ran it? What was it called? So one of the main ways you can find information about any children's home institution across the whole of Australia is to access the Find and Connect web resource, which was the one that Suzy Russell spoke about this morning. So I've just done a little snapshot of the searching page of Find and Connect. So Find and Connect includes short histories of every children's home that operated in Australia. It also provides information about the records that have survived, where they are held and how you would apply for access to them. You can look at lists of institutions that ran in a state or territory in a certain period. So if you don't know, you know your ancestor was in care in an institution in the 1930s to 30s to 50s era in Queensland, you can then look up a whole bunch of institutions and something might just ring a bell with what you know. You can search by suburbs, you can search by the type of institution and or who ran it. The website includes links to photographs, newspaper articles and much more. So it branches out to lots of different websites so you can look at original things. You can't search for names of people on the site because there are no personal records on the site, but the site can help you find where to go for records about an ancestor who was placed in an institution. Finally, many of you have probably heard of Ancestry.com. This is a subscription family history website, meaning that you have to use it, you have to sign up and pay a monthly fee. However, be aware that you can use that site for free at the State Library, and also if you become a member of Genealogy SA, which I highly recommend, you can pop in there and use that website in their library and other subscription websites. Ancestry can be a really useful site for searching, but you need to be aware that ordinary people create the trees on that site that may or may not be backed up with evidence. So always treat the information you find on there warily in cases where they're not linked to documents. However, it can be really useful for finding names of family members that you might want to do further searching on, and you can see relationships between people and where they are backed up by birth and or marriage records. You can also contact the creators of the trees to ask if they're happy to share other information. By searching on Ancestry, you can also find all those other things that I've referred to on there, the indexes to births, deaths and marriages, links to burial, funeral records, Electoral rolls, there's a lot of more eastern state, mostly electoral rolls in Western Australia, links to military records, extracts from police gazettes, photographs that people have uploaded, and much more. I did a very swift search for Everett Luke Sumner on Ancestry, and you can see the kinds of things that have popped up there. There is a family tree. It's a very small one, but it is there. There's his World War II service records, and there's a link to a police gazette and much more on that. So you can see from there, even if you didn't know anything at all and you didn't know his parents' names, you've got the parents' names up there, you've got the birth date and place of birth and the date of his death. You get an awareness that he was obviously in the military. You've already got a snapshot of this man just by searching his name. Anyway, I'm going to leave this talk there for now because we've got a lovely panel where you can throw questions at the whole lot of us and see whether we can think on our feet. But as this slide says, Aboriginal family history research requires patience and persistence. It can be really challenging. But the thing I was chatting to Klynton in the hallway a little while ago, we talked again about what he said about his mum, that she wasn't a natural researcher, but she was stubborn, she was persistent, and she pushed on with it, and she learned how to do it. And look what she created in the end. Absolutely amazing stuff that we all still used. You'll constantly be faced with dated and insensitive language. You'll hit roadblocks, you'll be frustrated, but you may also find amazing things. The other day, I was able to help a man confirm his Aboriginal heritage. He'd really only recently learned about the fact that he might have Aboriginal heritage when he attended a funeral. I just popped the names of his ancestors into an online search, actually on Ancestry, and up popped a police gazette, and I found information that instantly confirmed his Aboriginality and was able to share that with him just the other day, and seeing how that changed his life was really amazing. So do persist, do ask questions of all of us, and really good luck. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
I heard a round of applause in the background there. We have a question for you, Karen. Well, we're hoping that you might be able to answer it. What we'll do with the panel session is we will ask people attending to put your questions in the Q&A, and what we will do is find the correct panelist and we'll come and answer it for you. Now, Karen, do you know when the double burials first began?
Okay, now that would depend a lot on which state territory you're talking about, and it really was a lot about people who could afford to pay for a proper gravesite with a headstone and people who were more in the destitute burial type of situation. Where destitute burials and unmarked graves, you would get a lot of people put into the same area. But also, as you probably know, that grave sites, you can only pay for a certain amount of period of time that you actually own that, you lease that plot. So if a surviving family member doesn't contact to repay for that plot, they can then put another person on top. I can't tell you exactly when that started, and it would be different probably in each state territory. So maybe Google it. I'm not sure.
Okay, where might I find adoption information for a child born in 1866 at Meningie?
Okay, that's a difficult one because that's prior to the Adoption Act. So the Adoption Act was somewhere in the 1920s, somewhere there. So that can be really frustrating. Once you've got the Adoption Act coming in, you've got official adoptions occurring and you can apply for official adoption records. We do actually get a lot of people in that situation. And the problem lies in the fact is you don't know whether the name that you have for your ancestor is their actual birth name or a name that was given to them when they were privately adopted. So that is a very complex one. I would think trying to trace down the family name of the person to try to identify whether it might be the name they were given after adoption, but it is a difficult one that you may need to reach out to Genealogy SA and to Andrew at the museum, Andrew at State Records to get you some extra help around that one.
Yeah. Andrew, we have a question for you. Thanks, Karen. Do people require confirmation of Aboriginality forms if they wish to be recognised as such by government departments? Karen and Andrew can probably help with that.
I guess I'd start by saying if this is the requirement of a government department, whatever the reasons are, is peculiar or particular to that government agency. But I think where I'd like to focus is to say that where that is a requirement of a government agency, people in South Australia, particularly Adelaide, and I'm sure there are similar, people can go to if they're in regional areas in South Australia. But in Adelaide, I can mention Aboriginal legal right movement have a board that sit on a regular basis, and people can apply to them to have their case considered for confirmation of Aboriginality. I can't say exactly. Karen might be able to fill in some gaps here. They'll have certain questions, I'm sure, they'll ask to help them be assisted to know your circumstances, that they can consider those circumstances. Aboriginal legal right movement is one. Nunkuwarrin Yunti, the Aboriginal Community Centre in Wakefield Street in the city, also have a board, do similar, meet on a regular basis, and depending on what that criteria is, and they will approve those two organisations individually to give you something in return to say, yes, we recognise you have Aboriginal descent, and you can take that back to the government agency. If Karen would like to fill in any gaps, here she is.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yep, as Andrew said, Nunkuwarrin Yunti SA does assist with confirmation of Aboriginality. If you go onto our website and search for confirmation of Aboriginality, you can download the form and you can see what's required. One of the things that's important to know is Linkup SA doesn't work. They don't do work for confirmation of Aboriginality because we're working specifically for survivors of stolen generations. So we have another unit of Nunkuwarrin Yunti that deals with that. But the main thing if you're trying to do that is to get all those official records that connect you to the person that is your Aboriginal ancestor. So that if you've got that information of something that shows that person is Aboriginal, and then you've got all your birth and death and marriage certificates linked up with that, if you provide all that information in the first place, along with that form, it then goes, like Andrew said, to the board who meet monthly, and they deal with those applications. But go online, download and have a read on the Nunkuwarrin Yunti website around confirmation if that's what you want to do.
Great.
Good
Thanks,
luck.
Karen. Don't go yet. Oh, hang on. Now, we've got another couple of questions you may be able to help us with. What are the efforts to creating a central system of searching for family history for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Frustration can occur, guaranteed, from accessing these information sources or for those helping out in sourcing for them.
Yeah, there's no central database. You could probably say AIATSIS is one of the best places to go because they can draw all that stuff together and assist you with that and direct you out to all those other institutions. But as we said right at the beginning, those records are scattered across so many places, it would be almost impossible, probably impossible, to draw it all into one major database. So that's where you need to link in to each of those different, and having that awareness of how your family's records would have been kept. Where were they living? What kinds of organisations might have been watching over them? That can make it easier to work out where to go first. But definitely places like AIATSIS and the state records in your state and territory and South Australian Museum, those are the places you can go for that immediate assistance and then just branch out in that web from there.
Great. Thanks, Karen. I think Andrew Wilson can elaborate a bit more on that one as well.
Yep. Go for it.
While there's no one central one-stop shop place to go to, I mean, when people contact me as the go-to person, as the Senior Aboriginal Access Officer at State Records, it's my responsibility, as it would be for others you can go to, You may go to different other people who are working with different collections as a starting point. If it's me, that's the starting point. It's part of my job to not only know what's in our records relating to Aboriginal people held by state records, it's my job or responsibility to be aware of what is held by other institutions. So there's a referral process. Now, just a little bit more drilling down here. If it's specifically Aboriginal family history, I always think and would tell people to go to the South Australian Museum with respect to the Aboriginal family history records created by Norman Tyndale. They're pretty extensive. They relate to all major, or should say, mainland states in Australia. The Tyndale collection. So it's not just South Australia. It's other. Other people have other inquiries that are not so family history based. You know, we've talked about confirmation of Aboriginality. It might be academic research or professional research, and the needs of the researcher vary, as does where I would direct people to. But I guess getting back to an essential point I made earlier, you can expect people like myself and others behind other collections to be just as au fait about where to direct people with their inquiries, what institutions to go to, or for that matter, not just other public institutions with public records, but locally held records, records of historical societies, and much else has been mentioned. Trove. There are many other sources. If it's cemetery, it's cemetery. I mean, births. You know, not always birth, deaths, and marriages. You might we might direct you to, if we don't hold records, to a particular hospital for information about births. Look, there's just so many scenarios, but we have the expertise, I believe, collectively to effectively direct people where they need to go. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, we had a question from G. Pike, which was, how do we obtain a detailed map of the different tribes and their boundaries? I'm just going to post a link to Karen's answer on chat, just in case people aren't in touch with the Q&A, plus Karen's answer.
It depends which map you would like to have. The Horton map, which is probably the coloured one people have seen, is available. That's available from AIATSIS. The original Tyndale 1974 map you can get from the South Australian Museum. So 2 places to access those 2 maps.
Okay, and there was also, someone says, Michelle Toft, I noticed in Everett Sumner's war attestation papers that he was natural born. Yes. That is the same description given to all Australian-born service personnel. What resources demonstrate if someone is a first Australian?
In terms of military records, often it wasn't written down. A lot of Aboriginal people were not identified when they signed up. The only thing sometimes you can see is in the physical description. So, yeah, there's not always in military. Nick would probably be able to answer that better around military records. I don't know that I've ever seen the fact that someone's Aboriginal on a military record. Other places it is really a hit and miss game. Sometimes you just have to find, if Andrew Wilson finds somebody in his AIMS database mentioned, or if they're in the Bringing Them Home name index, all those kinds of places are going to, Aboriginal people are going to show up in those records. So that would be one way of seeing it. And as I said, that Police Gazette record or mention in a newspaper is sometimes where you get that first indication.
Yeah, not as Karen says, it can be difficult. But just going back to Everett Sumner's file in particular, I think I had a screenshot in the presentation where it actually says he needed permission from the Protector of Aborigines to enlist. So that was certainly in that instance, that was a detail that was relevant. And but yeah, in terms of a description, yeah, it's not. I suppose as well the location in terms of
Yeah.
you know, the Point Macleay there.
It's worth looking at some of the original records, the birth, death, marriage records. If you're lucky, it may have, there's a nationality section. Sometimes the birth, especially the birth records, will have Aboriginal instead of national born or native born, which means you're born in Australia, not that you have Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander heritage. So looking for the specific word Aboriginal can help too. Suzy from State Library was also saying that the Australian War Memorial has done a lot of work identifying, so it's worth looking through different sources, all of these different resources you've seen today, to see if the name comes up, and you may well be able to go to the museum or the original records to find out information. Thanks, Suzy. Now, could you please write how to look up the Tyndale reports? That needs to be done through the SA Museum. Would it go through the Family History Unit?
My dad. Sorry, my dad has just typed something in, which is quite sorry about that. That's why I was laughing. Can you please write how? Okay, so go to the South Australian Museum website, and there's a family history section of that website, so I would explore that. And also there is a search kind of thing, a bit like if some of you are aware of archive search, which is on the State Records Search, is an archive search kind of search where you can do some name searching through that, and that will pick up names of Aboriginal people in other records than just Norman Tyndale's material. I'm not sure that entirely answers your question, but I would contact the South Australian Museum Family History Unit for more information.
And for those of you who haven't seen the questions, Ron George, thank you for joining us, Ron.
Hi, Dad.
Says Norman Tyndale was Karen's grandfather. We now know where all of this research bug comes from. Okay.
You've answered that one?
Yep, we've answered that one. If you've got any more questions, I would throw them in the Q&A quickly. What else have we got? We've got some interesting chat that's been put up, links to different things. Okay. We have one new message. Who holds the records for Point Macleay, i.e. the Taplin diaries, letters to and from missions and government, births, marriages and deaths, not the official certificates? Suzy's going to come and answer some of that for us.
Some of Taplin's diaries are at the State Library of South Australia. On our, I don't know if we can go to the website. I'm going to make you go to my website.
We can, she won't earn the money. Hang on.
If we just go back to the State Library website, just any internet thing will be good.
You're talking.
Sorry. I'm giving you. Oh, I've typed it incorrectly. Always happens when people are watching.
Especially when there's 100 people watching.
Oh, no, don't say that.
Sorry. No, you've still got it wrong. Try again.
Can you feel for it? Does anyone else have something to say about Point Macleay?
I'll tap dance for you under the table. Just make it quick. I'm not good. Okay, we're back.
Okay. So if we go to the library guide and Aboriginal Australia and Aboriginal missions, the records that we have here at Point Macleay, we do have some records of the Aborigines Friends Association and also the papers of George Taplin and some Point Macleay records that consists of some like wage records, some census, births, deaths and marriages. Doesn't cover the entire period, but and some of those are on open access microfilm, so you can just come in and look. Others will need to be brought up from storage, but there's a reasonable amount of those records here at the State Library. I'm not sure if there are other archives that...
Rachel, you're online. Can you unmute yourself and tell us if Lutheran Archives have access to Point Macleay records as well? Oh, sorry, they're not a Lutheran mission. It helps if I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that it's not a Lutheran mission, so no, we don't have relevant records.
Okay.
And letters to and from missions and government is probably more likely to be at state records because they'll have the government correspondence.
Look on the Find and Connect web resource to find out. So if you type in Point Macleay and or Point Pearce on the Find and Connect web resource, which we showed you, you'll find the information about those missions who ran them. It was a government mission, both of those, and you'll see where the records are held. So they're scattered across different places. I know the museum has some material. I would think within Andrew's AIMS database, you'd find back and forwards correspondence from those missions to the government. So there'll be multiple places you'll get bits and pieces about those missions.
Thanks, Karen. And Sharon Miller, who submitted the question, we've just had some reply from Genealogy SA as well, so that should help. I think that's all we have. Hang on, I'm in the wrong. Are Taplin's genealogy sheets available to be accessed online? No, not online. No, but if they are in the State Library collection, you can request to view them in the reading room. Yes, I have a nod, so that will answer that one for you. Let's check chat. We're coming to the end of our time. Thank you, brilliant. Really good webinar. All positive feedback, wonderful. All right, someone said quick, close. We're going to close questions now, such to someone's relief. Thank you all for joining us today. We greatly appreciate your attendance. We will be sending out a link in the next couple of weeks to the recording. We'll also include a link to a fact sheet. And I'd like to thank all of the passionate people who've been on the working group with me putting all of this together. I think we've done an amazing job and we look forward to doing something similar again next year, perhaps. There's lots of nods, so you may hear from us again next year. Watch this space. Anyway, thank you all for attending. We will now hang up. Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.